Somewhere within a few miles of nearly every major city in North America, a masked animal is going about its night, exactly as if humans had built the block for its convenience. The raccoon, once a creature of river bottoms and hardwood forest, has become one of the most common wild mammals a person can encounter without ever leaving pavement. It does not fear traffic the way a deer does, and it does not vanish from a neighborhood the way a fox often will. Instead, it studies a street the way it once studied a creek bed, reading fences, gutters, and porches for the same information a wild raccoon once read from rocks and roots. Wildlife biologists tracking mammal populations across cities consistently find raccoons near the top of the list, often outnumbering more traditionally wild species like deer or coyotes within a given neighborhood. That is a strange kind of victory for an animal barely the size of a mid-sized house cat, armed with nothing sharper than a set of unremarkable teeth. No claws built for combat, no venom, no size advantage over a determined dog. And yet here it is, thriving in alleys under porches, and inside chimneys closer to the average American than almost any other wild mammal alive today. Understanding how a woodland omnivore pulled that off without evolving a single new weapon is really the story this entire hour is going to tell. In downtown Chicago, a maintenance crew once traced a strange scratching sound to an air handling vent 19 floors above, street level, certain they would find a pigeon, or perhaps a squirrel, that had wandered in through an open door. What they found instead was a fully grown raccoon calmly denned inside insulation meant to muffle building noise, having apparently climbed through a gap in an exterior duct and settled in for the season. Cases like that are not isolated flukes. Wildlife rescue groups in cities from Toronto to Atlanta report similar calls almost every year. Animals discovered in ventilation shafts, elevator machine rooms, and rooftop mechanical closets, far above anything resembling a tree line. For an animal built to climb tree trunks and den in hollow branches, a steel duct or a concrete stairwell apparently reads as a passable substitute, dark, sheltered, and difficult for predators to reach. Picture the vertical climb involved. Reaching the 19th floor by stairwell alone would wind most people twice over, yet a raccoon can cover that distance largely unnoticed, using pipe chases and utility gaps the way it would once have used branches. The instinct driving that choice is ancient. The infrastructure enabling it is entirely new. What results is a mismatch between a very old animal and a very modern building, one the raccoon seems to navigate without missing a step or a meal. Behind every raccoon sighting sits a scientific name that already tells part of the story. The genus name Procyon borrows from Greek roots, suggesting before the dog, likely a nod to the animal's nocturnal habits, since Procyon is also the name of a bright star that rises a few minutes ahead of Sirius, the star nicknamed the dog star in the eastern sky each autumn. The same pre-dawn gap any early riser watching the horizon might notice without knowing its name. The species name Lotor is Latin for washer, a reference to the animal's habit of dunking food and objects in water with its front paws, a behavior this program returns to in far greater depth later on. Put together, the full name translates roughly to washer that comes before the dog. An odd phrase for an animal that at first glance resembles none of those descriptions particularly well. Carl Linnaeus, the 18th century father of modern taxonomy, actually classified the raccoon among the bears. At first unsure where to place an animal with hands, a bear-like body, and habits unlike anything else naturalists had documented in Europe. Decades passed before the raccoon was moved into a genus of its own. That confusion makes sense. Few animals combine a predator's teeth, a primate's dexterity, and a bear's flat-footed walk into one compact package the way a raccoon does. The name eventually settled, but the puzzle behind it, what exactly this animal was, took the scientific world the better part of a century to sort out. City sanitation departments have tried in one form or another for decades. Latching lids, weighted lids, twist-lock lids, bungee-strapped lids, each design promoted at some point as the answer to raccoons raiding curbside trash. Some manufacturers went further, building cans that require a coordinated two-handed motion, on the theory that no wild animal could replicate a movement built around opposable human thumbs. Wildlife agencies in several states have even published guides ranking which container designs hold up best against determined raccoons, treating the problem with a seriousness usually reserved for home security. Homeowners have bought bungee cords by the case-weighted lids with bricks, and sprayed cans with ammonia pepper spray and vinegar, chasing whatever remedy the neighborhood happens to be trying that season. Small towns have passed ordinances requiring latched containers specifically because of raccoon complaints. None of this reads like an afterthought. It reads like an ongoing standoff waged nightly between a species with opposable thumbs and municipal budgets, and a species with neither fought over coffee grounds and chicken bones. That the contest stays close at all says something about the animal on the other side of it. And opponent city engineers keep underestimating and keep having to redesign around year after year, can after can. For a while, the marketing promised real hope. A new line of trash cans arrived, boasting a raccoon-proof rating tested and certified, the kind of claim that lets a homeowner sleep through the night without picturing a masked visitor rifling through last night's dinner. You bought one, maybe more than one. The listing mentioned reinforced latches and a locking mechanism engineered specifically with this animal in mind. Then came the morning after trash day, lid ajar, coffee grounds scattered across the driveway like evidence at a small, greasy crime scene, and the unmistakable sense that the can had lost. This is not a rare disappointment. Raccoon researchers and pest control operators alike report that most consumer-grade raccoon-resistant cans fail within a season or two of steady raccoon traffic, defeated by an animal willing to try the same latch dozens of times across a single week until it stumbles onto the sequence. That works. The manufacturer was not lying exactly. The can likely does resist a casual raccoon on a casual night. It rarely resists a hungry patient, one working the same target for a week straight. There is something almost admirable and more than a little humbling about losing a design battle to an animal with no thumbs, no instructions, and no reason to quit before the lid finally gives. Most folks who have lived beside raccoons for more than a season or two already know exactly how that story tends to end. Beneath the streets of more than one American city runs a second raccoon habitat almost nobody thinks to look for: the storm sewer system. Wildlife officers responding to reports of strange noises in drainage infrastructure have documented raccoons denning well inside these tunnels, using dry ledges above the water line as shelter that stays a fairly constant temperature regardless of the weather overhead. For an animal that already favors hollow trees, stream banks, and rock crevices in the wild, a concrete culvert offers many of the same qualities: darkness, protection from wind, and easy access to prey, like crayfish or frogs, that also make their way into drainage systems. Picture the tunnel network running beneath an ordinary city block, largely invisible from the surface, humming with runoff after every rain, and populated in places by an animal most residents assume lives only in the nearest patch of woods. Storm sewer raccoons turn up often enough that some municipal wildlife departments now include drainage infrastructure in their regular nuisance wildlife inspections, treating a tunnel much the way a forester might treat a hollow. Tadunang. Log. The tunnels were engineered purely to move water, with no thought given to wildlife at all. Yet a raccoon reads the resulting architecture as though it were custom built. That improvisation, translating a purely artificial structure into a livable substitute for a natural den, keeps showing up wherever this animal meets human infrastructure again and again. Long before any raccoon set a paw inside a storm sewer or an air duct, the animal had already earned its reputation the old way: one raided henhouse and one overturned garbage pail at a time. Farmers and rural households across generations came to know the raccoon as a nighttime thief, clever enough to lift a latch, patient enough to try again the next night if the first attempt failed. That reputation runs through American storytelling in tales where the raccoon plays the trickster, outsmarting bigger and supposedly wiser animals through nerve and cleverness rather than strength. Hunters who worked with raccoon hounds through the middle of the last century often spoke of the animal with a kind of grudging respect, describing chases that could stretch on for hours because the raccoon knew how to use water-thin branches and its own scent trail to throw dogs off course. That combination, mischief paired with genuine cunning, is what built the cultural shorthand still attached to the species today, the bandit mask doing double duty as both a physical feature and a character trait in the popular Rexon imagination. None of that reputation required a laboratory or a research grant. It came from generations of ordinary people watching the same animal solve the same problems night after night on farms and homesteads long before any scientist thought to write the behavior down. Chimneys without a working cap, attics with even a narrow gap beneath the eaves, abandoned cars left sitting long enough to gather rust and quiet. Each has turned up at one point or another, serving as a raccoon den somewhere in North America, cataloged by wildlife rescue organizations that field these calls as a routine part of the job. A chimney offers height darkness and warmth rising from below everything a den needs except a floor, which a mother raccoon solves by building a nest from insulation leaves or whatever soft material happens to be closest. An attic offers all of that, plus a dry, temperature-stable interior, which is exactly why homeowners across the country regularly discover raccoon families living directly above their bedrooms. Audible through the ceiling at night. Cars left idle in a barn, junkyard, or overgrown backyard provide something subtler, an enclosed metal shell, already weatherproofed by design, with just enough gaps around door seals and wheel wells for a determined raccoon to squeeze through. None of these locations were built with wildlife in mind. All of them get repurposed anyway, filtered through the same instinct that once sent this animal into hollow logs and abandoned burrows. The raccoon is not choosing chimneys and cars because it understands architecture. It is choosing dark, sheltered, elevated spaces, and human structures simply keep supplying more of them every year. Consider for a moment how most wildlife responds when a forest becomes a parking lot. Deer retreat toward whatever tree line remains. Foxes thin out or vanish from an area within a generation or two. Songbirds, tied to specific native plants, often disappear along with those plants. You would expect a forest-dwelling omnivore like the raccoon to follow the same pattern, pushed to the margins as habitat gives way to pavement. Instead, something close to the opposite happens. Raccoon populations in many suburban and urban areas match or exceed the densities researchers find in undisturbed wetland habitat, the richest natural raccoon habitat that exists. Where other species read concrete as an ending, the raccoon appears to read it as a translation. Streetlights standing in for moonlight, storm drains standing in for streambeds, and unsecured trash standing in for the varied buffet a forest floor once provided. That reversal, thriving where most comparable wildlife struggles, is not something biologists expected when American cities first began sprawling outward through the middle of the last century. It has forced a real rethink of what wildlife habitat even means for a species built around this much flexibility. Few animals have managed the leap from forest to freeway underpass this cleanly, and fewer still have managed it while multiplying rather than merely surviving. A raccoon needs no claws built for combat. It carries no venom, no unusual size, nothing resembling the weaponry that makes a wolf or a bear a headline predator. Its most visible achievement, defeating a redesigned trash can, sounds almost comic set beside the survival stories usually told about fiercer wildlife. Its dens turn up in air ducts, storm sewers, attics, and abandoned cars. Structures no field guide could have anticipated a century ago. Its population, rather than shrinking as forests give way to subdivisions, often grows to match or exceed what researchers find in the richest untouched wetlands. Every one of those details taken alone might read as a curiosity, a strange local news item about a masked animal in an unusual place. Taken together, they sketch something larger, an animal that has managed to keep pace with, and in many neighborhoods, outmaneuver the very species that built the cities around it. That is the real hook behind this animal, not danger, but a kind of quiet, persistent outmaneuvering that has been happening in plain sight for decades. None of it would be possible without one particular tool doing most of the work behind the scenes. The hands responsible for all of it turn out to be built like almost nothing else in the mammal world, and that is where the story goes next. Numbers rarely lie about who is really thriving in a given landscape. In some U.S. and Canadian cities' wildlife surveys have found raccoon densities running higher, sometimes many times higher than anything researchers record in the richest undisturbed wetland forest. Historically, the best habitat this species has. Picture a wooded creek bottom thick with crayfish, fruit trees, and hollow logs, generally considered close to raccoon paradise. Now picture a few blocks of older housing with mature shade trees, unsecured trash cans, and a scattering of bird feeders, and understand that the second location can, in the right circumstances, support more raccoons per acre than the first. That comparison surprised even biologists who study the species for a living, since it inverts almost every assumption built into traditional wildlife management, the idea that development displaces wild animals rather than concentrating them. What the city offers instead is a kind of habitat compression, food, water, and shelter, all packed within a much smaller radius than a raccoon would ever find naturally, cutting down the distance it needs to travel each night to survive comfortably. Fewer natural predators roam those same blocks as well, removing one of the checks that would otherwise hold rural populations in balance. Add all of that together, and an ordinary residential neighborhood starts to resemble from a raccoon's perspective the single richest piece of real estate available anywhere on the continent. A homeowner in the Pacific Northwest installed a home security camera, mostly to catch package thieves, then found herself with an entirely different kind of footage. Her brand new compost bin, purchased specifically for its wildlife-resistant latch and marketed with confident language about keeping raccoons and rodents out, lasted exactly 3 nights before the footage showed a raccoon working the latch open with what looked frankly like practiced patience. By night 4, the animal wasn't even fumbling anymore. It walked straight to the corner where the release mechanism sat, pressed down with one paw, and lifted the lid clean off. That clip made rounds online precisely because so many viewers recognized the scene from their own backyards. A $60 bin, a confident label, and a masked animal, treating the whole design like a mildly interesting puzzle rather than an obstacle. If you've ever bought the newer, sturdier trash can, convinced this time would finally be different, you already know how that particular chapter tends to end. The compost bin story simply happens to have video evidence, time-stamped and undeniable of the moment, a marketing claim quietly lost to an animal with no opposable thumbs and no patience for locked lids standing between it and dinner. Product designers keep trying. Raccoons keep watching, learning, and apparently keep winning. Strip away the biology for a moment and consider what that black mask does purely as an image. Across nearly a century of American cartoons, folktales, and children's books, the raccoon has been cast almost automatically as a rogue, a burglar, a small-time crook working the edges of respectable society, and the mask is doing most of that narrative work by itself. No other North American mammal wears anything resembling a disguise across its eyes, which makes the raccoon an easy visual shorthand for mischief long before a single fact about its actual behavior enters the story. Writers reached for that image again and again, casting the raccoon as the animal kingdom's small-time thief, clever, a little shady, never quite dangerous. That reputation predates modern wildlife biology, by generations rooted instead in observation passed down through rural households that watched this animal raid henhouses and gardens decade after decade. The mask became a kind of shorthand for the behavior, and the behavior reinforced the mask, each feeding the other until the raccoon's cultural identity solidified well before any laboratory ever tested how smart the animal actually was. What is worth remembering is that the mask itself serves a real biological purpose, having nothing to do with outlaw imagery, a detail this program returns to once the conversation turns from folklore to physiology later in this hour. Along stretches of interstate where concrete sound barriers rise between highway traffic and suburban backyards, wildlife crews have occasionally found something living inside the barrier itself, not beside it, but within gaps and hollow sections built into certain barrier designs for structural or drainage reasons. Raccoons denning inside these walls represent one of the more unlikely habitat choices documented in urban wildlife surveys, an animal settling into a structure engineered purely to block highway noise, repurposed as shelter tucked between 6 lanes of traffic and a row of suburban homes. The barrier offers exactly what a den needs, a dry, enclosed cavity insulated from weather, largely undisturbed by anything except passing vehicle noise, which the animal appears to tolerate, the way it once tolerated the ordinary sounds of a forest at night, wind, running water, other wildlife. From inside that concrete cavity, a mother raccoon can raise a litter within arm's reach, almost literally, of thousands of commuters a day, none of whom would ever guess what sits just beyond the wall. It is a strange kind of coexistence built entirely on the raccoon's willingness to treat infrastructure as landscape, reading a sound barrier the way its ancestors once read a rocky outcrop or a fallen tree. The highway was never meant to house wildlife. The raccoon simply noticed the vacancy anyway. Roll the clock back roughly 100 years, and the picture looks entirely different. Trapping records and early wildlife surveys from the first decades of the 20th century describe raccoon populations across much of the eastern and midwestern United States as modest, kept in check by heavy fur trapping widespread, habitat loss from agriculture, and a rural human population that hunted the animal both for pelts and to protect livestock. The raccoon fur trade alone drove significant harvest pressure through the 1800s and into the early 20th century, thinning populations across large stretches of its native range. What changed was not any single event, but a slow accumulation of shifts. Fur prices declined through the middle of the century. Trapping pressure eased. Farmland began reverting to secondary forest in many eastern states, and suburban development started supplying the kind of fragmented, edge-heavy habitat raccoons happened to exploit particularly well. Wildlife managers tracking the species through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s documented a clear rebound, then a surge, then in many areas an outright population boom that outpaced anything seen in the historical record. The raccoon populating your neighborhood tonight is in a very real sense living through a golden age its grandparents' never had access to. Few native mammals have staged a comeback quite this dramatic or quite this quiet within living memory. A family in Ohio came home from a week away to find their porch swing sagging oddly to one side, and on closer inspection discovered the cushion had been hollowed out from within, foam and stuffing rearranged into a surprisingly tidy nest, currently occupied by one very unbothered raccoon riding out a February storm in what amounted to the coziest seat on the property. If you have ever left a porch swing, a grill cover, or a garden shed unchecked for more than a few weeks over a winter, you may already have a rough idea how this story tends to unfold, since this particular kind of discovery turns up often. Enough in wildlife removal reports to qualify as a minor, seasonal tradition rather than a rare event. The cushion offered exactly what the animal needed: insulation, a windbreak, and enough elevation to stay clear of standing snow, all conveniently pre-assembled by a furniture manufacturer, with no wildlife in mind whatsoever. Homeowners describe the moment of discovery with a mix of alarm and more often than not a kind of grudging amusement once the initial surprise wears off, since it is difficult to stay genuinely angry at an animal that simply outplanned everyone for the winter using furniture nobody else was using anyway. The swing understandably needed new cushions. The raccoon presumably needed nothing at all, having already solved the season on its own terms. Few North American mammals can claim genuine comfort across quite this range of settings. In a Florida marsh, raccoons wade through shallow water, hunting crayfish and frogs, using the same dense wetland vegetation their ancestors relied on for cover long before European settlement. A few thousand miles north, in a Michigan barn, through a hard winter raccoon's den in haylofts and unused stalls, tolerant of freezing temperatures that would be unthinkable for their subtropical relatives. Meanwhile, in a downtown Chicago alley, raccoons navigate a landscape of dumpsters, fire escapes, and delivery trucks, following routes as consistent and deliberate as any commuters. Three environments that share almost nothing in climate, vegetation, or human activity, yet each supports a stable, often thriving raccoon population, drawing on the same basic toolkit of dexterous paws, flexible diet, and a willingness to den wherever shelter presents itself. That range of tolerance is unusual even among generalist species, most of which specialize at least somewhat in temperature, moisture, or available prey. The raccoon appears to specialize instead in adaptability itself, treating climate and geography as details to work around rather than barriers to respect. Wildlife biologists sometimes describe this quality using the term ecological generalist, but the raccoon's actual range of comfortable habitat pushes past even what that label typically implies. Pick up the phone at a municipal animal control office in almost any mid-sized American city, and raccoons dominate the call log more consistently than any other wild mammal ahead of coyotes, deer, and even the occasional loose dog. Complaints range widely. An animal denned in an attic, a family living beneath a deck, overturned trash cans on a weekly basis, or simply a raccoon spotted crossing a yard in broad daylight, which understandably alarms residents even though daytime activity does not automatically indicate illness in this species. Cities, including Toronto, Washington, and Chicago, have each at different points described raccoons as their single most common urban wildlife complaint. A distinction that says as much about population density as it does about the animal's boldness around people. Wildlife officers fielding these calls often note a pattern. Residents rarely call about a raccoon they merely glimpsed at a distance. They call because the animal has moved into a structure, a nuisance category. Most other urban wildlife simply does not generate at the same volume. Deer avoid buildings. Coyotes avoid buildings. Raccoons, given the smallest opportunity, treat a building as an opportunity worth exploring. That single behavioral difference, a willingness to move directly into human structures rather than merely passing through them, likely explains why this particular animal keeps topping call logs that track wildlife across an entire city, year after year. Set a raccoon beside a coyote, and the comparison seems almost unfair. The coyote runs faster, hunts cooperatively, and carries jaws built for taking down prey many times its own size. Set a raccoon beside a red fox, and the gap looks similar, a sleeker, faster animal with sharper predatory instincts. And yet, across many American cities, raccoon populations match or exceed both of those supposedly better-equipped competitors, thriving in the same neighborhoods while facing many of the same pressures. The explanation has less to do with any single advantage and more to do with flexibility stacked upon flexibility. A coyote needs consistent access to prey animals or reliable scavenging opportunities. A raccoon needs almost anything remotely edible, plant or animal, fresh or already spoiled, and can shift its diet week to week based purely on whatever happens to be available. A fox tends to avoid dense human activity more than a raccoon does, retreating toward quieter margins rather than pushing directly into occupied buildings. None of this makes the raccoon a superior predator in any conventional sense. It makes the raccoon a superior improviser, willing to eat what a coyote would ignore and to den where a fox would never risk it. In a landscape built entirely around human convenience, that willingness to improvise appears to outweigh raw speed or strength almost every time. Stack every detail from this opening stretch together and a clear shape starts to emerge. An animal with no real weapons has defeated engineered trash cans across an entire country. A creature built for hollow trees has colonized air ducts, storm sewers, sound barriers, and porch furniture without missing a single winter. A population thinned by heavy trapping a century ago has rebounded into one of the densest, most successful wild mammal populations anywhere on the continent, outpacing faster, sharper-toothed competitors along the way. None of that success traces back to size, speed, or aggression, the traits most people instinctively associate with a thriving wild animal. It traces instead to something quieter and in its own way more impressive, an unmatched willingness to treat nearly any structure as shelter and nearly any food source as dinner. That quality alone explains the paradox, sitting at the center of this whole story. An animal small enough to fit in your arms that has nonetheless outmaneuvered an entire built environment designed without it in mind. Understanding why takes more than watching a raccoon raid a trash can, though. It requires looking closely at the animal itself, starting with the one part of its body doing more of that outmaneuvering than any other, a pair of hands unlike almost anything else in the mammal world, which is exactly where this story turns next. Run your fingertip across a rough surface in complete darkness, and you get a rough approximation of what a raccoon experiences constantly through its front paws, except amplified well beyond ordinary human sensitivity. Researchers studying raccoon anatomy have found forepaw skin packed with a strikingly high concentration of mechanoreceptors, the specialized nerve cells responsible for detecting pressure, texture, and shape. Compared to most mammals of similar body size, a raccoon's front paws carry a noticeably denser network of these receptors, closer in some respects to what researchers find in primates than in other members of the raccoon's own carnivore order. That density means a raccoon is not simply grabbing an object the way a dog or a cat might. It is gathering detailed physical information the moment contact happens, texture, weight, shape, and rigidity, all registering nearly simultaneously. Picture running your hand along a kitchen drawer, sorting silverware by feel alone without glancing down, and you have a rough sense of what a raccoon's forepaws are doing constantly while foraging along a creek bed or through a pile of leaf litter. That level of tactile resolution did not evolve for convenience. It evolved because this animal spends much of its life foraging at night or underwater. Conditions where eyesight offers little help and touch has to carry nearly the entire burden of finding food. Look closely at a raccoon's front paw, closer than most people ever get the chance to, and you will find something easy to miss. Entirely short, stiff hairs growing directly from the tip of each toe positioned just above the claw itself. These are vibrissae, the same category of specialized sensory hair responsible for a cat's whiskers, though positioned here in a spot almost no other mammal bothers to place them. Unlike ordinary fur, vibrissae are rooted deeply enough to connect directly into the nervous system, transmitting detailed information about anything they brush against even before the surrounding skin makes contact. On a raccoon's toes, that arrangement puts a sensory outpost at the very leading edge of every reach, registering the presence, texture, and rough shape of an object, a fraction of a second before the paw itself closes around it. Most animals rely on facial whiskers alone for this kind of pre-contact sensing, useful for close-range navigation around the head. A raccoon effectively extends that same capability out to the end of its arms, giving each paw its own miniature early warning system for whatever lies just ahead. It is a small anatomical detail, easy to overlook, and yet it stands as one of the clearer physical signs of just how much this animal's entire toolkit has been engineered around the sense of touch rather than sight. The practical result of those toe-tip vibrissae is a kind of sensing that happens just ahead of actual contact, closer to a blind person's cane, tapping the ground a half step before the foot follows, than to an ordinary grasping motion. A raccoon foraging through submerged mud or leaf litter on a moonless night is not groping around randomly hoping to bump into something edible. It is sweeping its forepaws through the material with those sensory hairs leading the way, registering shape and texture from objects it has not yet fully touched, then adjusting its approach before committing to a grip. That distinction matters enormously for an animal whose best foraging often happens underwater or in complete darkness. Conditions where committing to the wrong object wastes time and energy a nocturnal forager cannot easily spare. Researchers studying this behavior have compared it to a form of remote sensing information gathered at a slight distance rather than only through direct contact, an ability more commonly associated with insects and certain fish than with mammals. For a raccoon working a creek bottom in complete darkness, that early information is often the difference between locating a crayfish in seconds and wasting a long stretch of a short night sifting through empty mud. Touch in this animal's world starts working before contact even begins. Brains allocate space according to priority, and a raccoon's brain makes its priorities unmistakably clear. Neuroanatomical studies mapping the raccoon's somatosensory cortex, the brain region responsible for processing touch, have found an outsized portion of that region, dedicated specifically to input arriving from the front paws, a proportion notably higher than researchers find in most other mammals studied to date. In practical terms, this means a raccoon devotes more raw brain tissue to interpreting what its hands feel than most animals devote to any single sense at all. Compare that to a dog whose sensory cortex leans heavily towards smell, or a hawk whose brain prioritizes vision almost above everything else. A raccoon's brain, by contrast, is quietly organized around touch, first treating its forepaws less like simple grasping tools and more like a second set of eyes working in the dark. That kind of dedicated processing does not happen by accident. It reflects millions of years spent foraging along riverbanks and through leaf litter, environments where a keen nose or sharp eyesight offers only limited help, and where success depends almost entirely on what the hands can discern through contact alone. The raccoon, in a very real anatomical sense, experiences much of its world not by looking at it but by touching it first and understanding it through that touch. It is tempting watching a raccoon deftly unlatch a cooler or peel open a snack wrapper to assume it must have something close to a human hand tucked beneath that fur. It does not quite. A raccoon's forepaw carries 5 digits, same as a human hand, but none of them functions as a true, opposable thumb capable of pressing fully against the other fingers the way a human thumb can. Instead, the raccoon relies on a combination of flexible digits, a loosely structured wrist, and that remarkable tactile sensitivity to compensate for what a strict anatomist would call a missing feature. The result is a grip that looks almost human at a glance, but works through an entirely different mechanical strategy, closer to a practiced grasp than a true precision pinch. That distinction explains a lot about raccoon behavior that otherwise seems contradictory. The animal can manipulate latches, twist lids, and pry open containers with startling competence, yet it cannot perform certain fine motor tasks that come easily to a human hand, threading something small through a narrow gap, for instance. Tends to give a raccoon far more trouble than opening a straightforward mechanical latch. Nature, in this case, built something that mimics human dexterity closely enough to fool a casual observer using an entirely different set of tools to get there. For generations, anyone who watched a raccoon dunk its food in a creek or a bird bath assumed they were witnessing a tidy animal washing its dinner before eating, an image charming enough that it worked its way straight into the species' scientific name. The actual explanation, uncovered through closer study of raccoon physiology, points somewhere else entirely. Submerging the forepaws in water appears to soften the outer layer of skin, covering those dense clusters of mechanoreceptors, temporarily increasing their sensitivity and sharpening the animal's ability to read fine texture and shape. In other words, a raccoon dunking a crayfish or a piece of fruit is not scrubbing away dirt. It is in effect wetting its fingertips to feel more clearly. The rough equivalent of a person moistening a finger before turning the page of an old dry book. That distinction matters, because raccoons perform this exact behavior even when nothing about the food genuinely needs cleaning, and even when the object involved is not food at all, sometimes running paws through water while inspecting an entirely inedible item out of what looks more like curiosity than hygiene. The washing story survives mostly because it is easy to picture and matches how a human might interpret the motion. The touch story, less familiar but far better supported, gives the same behavior a very different and arguably more interesting explanation. Once the water sensitivity explanation is on the table, a lot of previously puzzling raccoon behavior starts making a great deal more sense. Captive raccoons kept without regular access to water have been observed performing the exact same dunking and rubbing motions using an empty bowl, or even against a dry surface, going through the physical routine, with no water present at it all. That detail alone argues strongly against a simple hygiene explanation, since scrubbing food clean requires water to accomplish anything while reading texture through a practiced motion, does not the gesture itself apparently carrying value independent of moisture. Researchers now generally describe the behavior as dousing rather than washing, a small shift in terminology that reflects a much larger shift in understanding. Moving away from a tidy, almost domestic image and toward a picture of an animal gathering sensory information, the way a person might turn an unfamiliar object over in their hands before deciding what it is. The old washing explanation was not entirely without basis. Since water genuinely does sharpen the paw's sensitivity somewhat, it simply had the purpose backward framing an act of investigation as an act of cleanliness. For an animal whose entire foraging strategy runs through its hands rather than its eyes, dousing turns out to be less about tidiness and much more about paying close attention. Watch a pet raccoon or one raised in captivity, and sooner or later you will likely catch it going through the exact motions of dousing, without a drop of water in sight, working its paws over a toy or a piece of food, as though an invisible stream were running beneath it. Wildlife rehabilitators who have raised orphaned raccoon kits report this pattern often enough that it barely registers as unusual to anyone experienced with the species. An animal instinctively performing a behavior tied to water, even when none is available, simply because the underlying motion itself carries value on its own. That persistence tells researchers something important about how deeply wired this behavior really is. Not a learned habit tied narrowly to actual washing, but closer to an inherited instinct built around investigating objects through touch, with water serving only as an occasional enhancement rather than a required ingredient. If you have ever watched a house cat knead a blanket with no memory of ever nursing, you have seen a rough parallel, an old instinct persisting well past the situation that originally shaped it. The raccoon's dryland dousing works the same way, an ancient foraging behavior surfacing reliably, regardless of circumstance. It is one more piece of evidence that this animal experiences much of the world. Hand-first water or no water, an old habit far too useful to abandon just because the creek happens to be missing. That black patch running across a raccoon's eyes has done more cultural work than almost any other marking on any North American mammal shorthand for mischief in 1,000 cartoons and stories. Its actual biological purpose, though, has nothing to do with outlaw imagery and everything to do with function. Researchers studying nocturnal mammals have proposed that dark fur surrounding the eyes helps absorb ambient light and reduce glare, working in a manner loosely comparable to the black grease football players once smeared beneath their eyes, to cut down reflected sunlight during day games. For an animal whose entire nightly routine depends on functioning eyesight in low-light conditions, even a small reduction in glare from moonlight, streetlights, or reflective water could meaningfully sharpen night vision at the margins. The mask likely also plays a secondary role in communication between raccoons, a visually distinct facial marking that stands out even in dim conditions, potentially helping individuals recognize expressions or postures at a distance where subtler facial cues might otherwise be lost. Two separate purposes then layered into a single marking, one functional and rooted in optics, one social and rooted in recognition. It is a reminder that even a raccoon's most famous physical trait, the one responsible for its entire outlaw reputation, exists first and foremost because it helps the animal survive the dark, not because it looks the part. Behind that glare-reducing mask sits an eye built specifically for operating long after most other mammals have called it a night. A raccoon's retina carries a high concentration of rod cells, the type of photoreceptor responsible for detecting light and motion in dim conditions at the expense of cone cells, which handle color and fine detail in brighter light. That trade-off is typical of nocturnal mammals generally, but the raccoon's version is tuned particularly well for foraging in the kind of low, inconsistent light found along a shaded creek bed at midnight or a poorly lit alley behind a restaurant. Many nocturnal mammals also carry a reflective layer behind the retina called the tapetum lucidum, the same structure responsible for the eerie eye shine seen in headlights, which bounces unused light back through the retina for a second chance at detection, effectively amplifying whatever dim light is available. The net effect gives a raccoon meaningfully sharper night vision than a human could manage under identical conditions, able to detect motion and shape in near darkness that would leave a person groping blindly. None of this makes a raccoon's eyesight especially sharp by daylight standards, a trade this animal accepted somewhere back in its evolutionary history in exchange for genuine mastery of the dark. For a creature that does virtually all of its important living after sunset, that trade has clearly paid off. Ask what color a raccoon actually sees when it looks at a red brick wall or a green garden hose, and the honest answer is probably not what you would picture. Studies of raccoon retinal structure indicate a limited number of cone cell types, the receptors responsible for distinguishing color, suggesting the animal's world likely appears in a narrower, more muted range of hues than a humans does, closer to what researchers describe in dogs than to full human color vision. Reds and greens in particular may blur together or read as similar shades, while blues and yellows likely remain more distinct. That limitation is not a flaw so much as a trade, the same evolutionary bargain that shows up across most nocturnal mammals. Since building a retina dense with color-sensing cone cells comes at the direct expense of the light-catching rod cells that make functioning after dark possible at all. A raccoon simply never needed to distinguish a ripe red berry from an unripe green one by color alone, relying instead on texture, scent, and that remarkable sense of touch to make the same determination. Picture an old black and white television broadcast, still perfectly capable of conveying motion, shape, and drama, just without the vivid color layered on top. That is roughly the visual world. A raccoon likely inhabits a world built for function in darkness rather than beauty in daylight, and one this animal has clearly gotten along with just fine. Human hearing generally tops out somewhere around 20,000 hertz, a ceiling most people stop noticing by middle age, as the higher end of that range quietly fades. A raccoon's hearing extends considerably beyond that ceiling into frequency ranges, well above what any human ear can register, closer to the hearing range documented in cats than in most other members of the raccoon's own family. That extended range matters enormously for an animal hunting small prey in total darkness, since many of the creatures a raccoon targets, insects, small rodents, even certain amphibians, produce sounds concentrated in those higher frequencies. Rustling, scratching, and high-pitched calls that would pass completely unnoticed by human ears standing in the exact same spot. A raccoon working a woodpile or a leaf pile at night is not relying primarily on sight to locate a hidden meal. It is listening for a register of sound. Most people have never consciously experienced picking out the faint scratch of movement the way a person might pick out a familiar voice in a crowded room. That gap between what a raccoon hears and what a human hears standing beside it is worth sitting with for a moment, since it means the two of you sharing the exact same backyard on the exact same night are effectively listening to two different soundscapes entirely, one considerably richer and more detailed than the other. Most mammals that climb trees face the same basic problem coming back down. Gravity works against a head-first descent, since a standard ankle joint simply cannot bend far enough backward to keep the claws gripping bark while the body points downward. A raccoon solves that problem with a joint most mammals simply do not have. Its hind ankle can rotate a full 180 degrees, allowing the rear foot to pivot completely backward, claws still hooked into the bark even as the body faces straight down toward the ground. That degree of rotation is unusual enough among mammals that it puts the raccoon in fairly select company, a group that includes squirrels and a handful of other skilled tree climbers, but excludes the great majority of climbing mammals, most of which are functionally restricted to climbing up and then backing carefully down in reverse. Watch video of a raccoon descending a tree trunk, and the movement can look almost unnatural. At first glance, the body rotated at an angle no human joint could replicate without serious injury. For the raccoon, it is simply Tuesday, one more advantage layered onto an already impressive climbing toolkit. That ankle alone likely explains a fair amount of the animal's comfort denning at real height in trees, in attics, in the upper floors of buildings, since a fast, confident way back down removes much of the risk that height would otherwise carry. Picture the everyday version of climbing down a ladder, careful, deliberate, facing the rungs the entire way, because reversing that orientation would be both awkward and dangerous. That is roughly how most tree-climbing mammals handle a descent, backing down slowly, rear end leading the way, eyes fixed upward toward the branch they just left. A raccoon skips that entire careful process. Thanks to its rotating hind ankle, it can simply turn around at the top of a descent and come down headfirst the same direction it went up, moving with a speed and confidence that would be reckless for almost any other mammal attempting the side. Identical maneuver. That capability changes the entire calculation around denning at height, since a raccoon fleeing a threat, or simply heading out to forage, never needs to pause and reposition before making its exit. It just goes headfirst fast, using gravity as an ally rather than an obstacle to manage carefully. Squirrels share this trick, which is part of why the two species can seem almost interchangeable at a glance while navigating a tree trunk, moving with that same fluid, gravity-defying confidence. For an animal that dens in hollow trees, chimneys, and increasingly the upper floors of human buildings, that headfirst descent is not a minor party trick. It is a genuine survival advantage, one more piece of anatomy quietly built around a life spent well above the ground. Watch a dog or a cat walk, and you are watching an animal that moves on its toes, heels lifted permanently off the ground, a stance called digitigrade that favors speed over stability. A raccoon does something different, and something far more familiar to any human watching. It walks plantigrade, placing the entire sole of the foot flat against the ground, with each step heel included. The same basic stance a person uses walking down a sidewalk. Bears share this same plantigrade stance, which is part of why raccoon tracks in mud or snow can sometimes get mistaken for a small bear's. At first glance, an oddly human-like little footprint pressed into the dirt beside a creek. That flat-footed gait trades away some speed compared to a sprinting dog or a pouncing cat, but it buys stability and balance, in return useful qualities for an animal that spends considerable time navigating uneven surfaces. Wet rocks along a stream, narrow branches, sloped rooftops, the kind of terrain where a sure, grounded footing matters more than raw speed ever would. It also allows a raccoon to rise onto its hind legs and stand upright for stretches at a time, surveying its surroundings or freeing its front paws entirely, a posture that a digitigrade animal like a dog manages only briefly and awkwardly by comparison. Slow and steady in this case comes with its own set of real advantages. Every raccoon carries a bushy tail marked with alternating dark and light rings, typically somewhere between 4 and 10 bands, depending on the individual, a pattern distinctive enough that it functions almost like a signature. Researchers have floated a fairly practical explanation for that ringed pattern beyond simple decoration. High contrast banding tends to remain visible in low light longer than a solid uniform color would, since the eye can pick out the boundary between light and dark bands, even when overall brightness is fading fast. For a mother raccoon leading kits through dim woods or a dark backyard at night, a highly visible tail bobbing along just ahead could serve as an easy visual anchor. Something small kits with less developed night vision can follow without losing track of her in low light. That explanation remains somewhat provisional since raccoon tail patterns have not been studied as thoroughly as some other aspects of the animal's biology, and researchers are careful to describe it as a plausible function rather than a fully settled fact. Even without total certainty, the pattern fits a broader theme, running through nearly every part of this animal's body, a system quietly built around functioning well after dark. Whether it evolved primarily to keep kits close, aid balance, or serve some combination of purposes, that ringed tail remains one of the raccoon's most recognizable and still not entirely explained features. Beneath the coarse outer fur, most people picture when they think of a raccoon, sits a second, far denser layer. Most casual observers never notice a thick undercoat built almost entirely for insulation. That undercoat traps a layer of warm air close to the skin. Functioning much like a good winter coat, traps body heat against a cold wind, and it thickens noticeably as autumn advances, preparing the animal for temperatures its ancestors believed to have originated in warmer regions further south, likely never had to contend with in quite the same way. As raccoons expanded their range northward into Canada and the colder reaches of the American Midwest and Northeast over recent centuries, this dense undercoat became one of the key traits, allowing the species to tolerate genuinely harsh winters rather than simply retreating southward each year. The outer guard hairs coarser and longer shed water and add a layer of protection against wind and moisture, while the softer undercoat underneath does the actual work of retaining body heat. Trap a hand along a wild raccoon's back in January, something wildlife researchers occasionally do. For health assessments, and the difference between the two fur layers becomes immediately obvious. The outer coat rough and weather-worn, the underlying layer soft, dense, and noticeably warm even in freezing air. It is a fairly ordinary adaptation among northern mammals, but an essential one for an animal that, unlike many of its neighbors, refuses to simply sleep through the coldest months entirely. Come September and October, a raccoon's priorities shift almost entirely toward one goal: eating as much as often as possible, for as long as the season allows. Wildlife biologists tracking seasonal weight changes have documented raccoons packing on close to a third of their total body weight in fat during this pre-winter feeding push. A dramatic swing that would be roughly equivalent to a 150-pound adult gaining 50 pounds of pure fat reserve in the space of about 2 months. That fat accumulates in a fairly even layer across the body, providing both insulation against the coming cold and, more importantly, a stored energy reserve. The animal will draw on steadily through the leanest stretches of winter, when natural food sources become scarce or buried under snow. A raccoon foraging heavily through October is not simply enjoying seasonal abundance for its own sake. It is running against a hard biological deadline, since the fat reserve built during these weeks essentially determines whether the animal survives to spring. Picture the difference between packing enough supplies for a short weekend trip versus provisioning for a genuine months-long expedition with no resupply along the way, and you have a rough sense of the stakes riding on that autumn feeding push. By the time the first real snow falls, a raccoon's entire winter survival strategy has already been quietly decided, one extra meal at a time. Once winter genuinely sets in, that carefully built fat reserve stops being a comfortable cushion and starts functioning as the raccoon's entire fuel supply, drawn down steadily through the coldest, leanest stretches of the season when almost nothing edible remains reliably available above the snow line, unlike a squirrel, which caches food through the fall and can retrieve it periodically, even in winter. A raccoon relies far more heavily on that internal reserve alone, entering long stretches of reduced activity precisely to conserve the fat it spent October building. Every day spent sheltering in a den rather than foraging represents a small, calculated withdrawal from that reserve. A trade the animal's body makes, automatically favoring stillness and warmth over the energy cost and thin reward of searching for food across frozen, largely barren ground. By the time the first real thaw arrives in late winter, a raccoon that entered the season well-fed can look noticeably leaner, having burned through a substantial share of the reserve it built just months earlier. That cycle, feast through autumn, careful rationing through winter, repeats every single year of a raccoon's life. An annual bet placed each fall on whether enough fat was stored to make it through whatever the coming winter decides to throw at it. It is a demanding rhythm, and not every individual survives it. But it is also precisely the kind of rhythm that has kept this species thriving across climates its ancestors never had to endure. Step back from any single feature, and a clear pattern emerges across nearly the entire raccoon body plan. The hands carry a density of touch receptors, rivaling far larger-brained animals backed by sensory hairs that detect an object before contact even occurs. The mask cuts glare and likely aids in facial recognition in dim conditions. The eyes trade color and daytime sharpness for genuine mastery of low light. The ears pick up frequencies well beyond anything a human standing in the same yard could hope to register. The ankles rotate in ways that let the animal descend from real height at speed headfirst without hesitation. Even the fur and the seasonal fat cycle exist to buy this animal safe passage through conditions. Cold northern winters that its ancestors likely never evolved to handle in the first place. None of these traits developed in isolation. Each one reinforces the others, building toward a single coherent design, an animal engineered from nose to tail for operating competently, even confidently, in conditions that leave most other mammals cautious or simply asleep. That design explains a great deal of what made the opening hour of this story possible. At all the trash cans defeated in darkness, the dens built in impossible places, the confident navigation of an entire nocturnal world, humans mostly sleep through. What remains is the mind directing all of that remarkable hardware, and that mind, it turns out, has surprised researchers just as much as the body has. In the early 1900s, a researcher named Lawrence Cole set out to answer a fairly simple question about raccoons using a fairly elaborate method. Working over roughly an 8-year stretch from 1907 into the mid-1910s, Cole built a series of mechanical locks of increasing complexity, hooks, latches, and bolt mechanisms that required specific sequences of movement to open, then presented them to captive raccoons, one at a time, to see how each animal responded. This was long before anyone had settled on standard methods for testing animal cognition, and Cole's approach reads today almost like an engineer's fascination colliding with a naturalist's curiosity, treating the raccoon less like a simple lab animal and more like a genuine mechanical puzzle to be solved on its own terms. The locks grew progressively harder across the study, forcing each raccoon to combine multiple distinct actions in the correct order rather than relying on a single simple motion. That structure allowed Cole to track not just whether raccoons could solve problems, but how their approach changed as the challenges compounded. It was an unusually rigorous project for its era, conducted decades before psychology departments routinely studied animal cognition with this kind of structured, escalating design, and it quietly laid groundwork for how researchers would study raccoon intelligence for the next century. The results from Cole's mechanical lock experiments surprised even a researcher who had clearly expected something noteworthy going in. Several of the raccoons tested managed to solve individual locks in fewer than 10 attempts, a pace of learning that compared favorably against results researchers of the era had documented in animals, generally considered far more cognitively capable. Picture handing someone an unfamiliar combination lock with no instructions and watching them figure out the correct sequence through trial and error inside of 10 tries. Then remember that this particular someone was working the mechanism with paws rather than fingers, guided largely by touch rather than a clear view of the moving parts. What made the raccoons' performance especially notable was not simply that they eventually succeeded, but how quickly the pattern of trial and error narrowed toward a consistent, efficient solution, suggesting the animals were genuinely learning the mechanism rather than stumbling onto the answer by pure chance. Cole documented individual variation as well, some raccoons solving locks considerably faster than others, a detail that hinted at real differences in problem-solving ability between individual animals rather than a single fixed species-wide capability. For a study conducted in the earliest years of the 20th century, using nothing more sophisticated than hand-built mechanical locks and careful observation, it produced a result that still holds up as a genuinely impressive demonstration of raccoon learning more than a century later. Cole pushed his experiments a step further, testing not just whether raccoons could learn a lock mechanism, but whether that learning reflected genuine understanding or simple muscle memory tied to one fixed orientation. He rotated the locks, sometimes flipping them upside down or repositioning them at a different angle, forcing each raccoon to solve the identical mechanical problem from an unfamiliar physical perspective. If the animals had simply memorized a specific sequence of paw movements without truly grasping how the lock worked, this change should have sent them back to square one, fumbling through trial and error all over again. Instead, several raccoons solved the reoriented locks considerably faster than they had solved the original versions, suggesting the animals had built something closer to a genuine mental model of the mechanism itself rather than a rigid, orientation-specific habit. That distinction matters enormously in how researchers think about animal cognition, since it separates rote physical memorization from something closer to actual problem comprehension. A raccoon adapting quickly to a rotated lock is doing something conceptually similar to a person recognizing that a familiar key still works the same way even when the door happens to be mounted sideways. For an animal operating with a brain far smaller than a human's, that flexibility hinted at a level of understanding well beyond simple trial and error conditioning, a finding that quietly reshaped how seriously researchers took raccoon intelligence going forward. Cole's century-old results might have remained a historical curiosity if later researchers had not returned to test the same basic question using more modern methods and equipment. Contemporary studies on raccoon problem-solving have repeatedly confirmed the broad strokes of what those early lock experiments suggested: animals capable of learning multi-step mechanical solutions relatively quickly, adapting flexibly when a familiar problem gets presented in an unfamiliar form, and retaining what they learned well beyond a single testing session. Modern equipment allows for considerably more precise measurement than Cole ever had access to, tracking exactly which paw movements succeed, which fail, and how quickly an individual animal's approach becomes more efficient across repeated attempts. Those refinements have only reinforced the original conclusion, rather than overturning it, giving today's researchers a level of confidence in raccoon problem-solving ability that Cole, working with hand-built wooden locks and careful handwritten notes, could only have hoped for. It is a fairly rare thing in science, a finding from the earliest years of the 20th century, holding up so consistently once modern methods finally caught up to test it properly. That durability says something meaningful about both the rigor of the original study and, more importantly, the genuine cognitive ability of the animal at the center of it. A reputation for cleverness that has now survived more than 100 years of scientific scrutiny without buckling. Solving a problem is one kind of intelligence. Remembering the solution years later without any practice in between is another kind entirely, and raccoons appear to manage both. Studies tracking raccoon memory retention have found that animals taught to solve a specific task can still perform that same task correctly after gaps of up to 3 years. A remarkably long span for an animal with a brain considerably smaller than that of many species. Researchers consider its cognitive equal. Picture learning to operate an unfamiliar tool once, then being handed that same tool 3 years later with no reminder in between and still knowing exactly how it works without hesitation. That is roughly the standard raccoons have met in controlled memory studies, retention spanning a meaningful fraction of the animal's entire natural lifespan, since wild raccoons rarely live past 5 years to begin with. Long-term memory of this kind requires more than simple habit formation. It suggests the raccoon brain encodes certain learned solutions in a durable, lasting way, closer to how humans might remember how to ride a bicycle decades after last attempting it than to a fragile short-term habit that fades within weeks. For a nocturnal forager, whose survival often depends on remembering which strategies worked at which locations across changing seasons, that kind of durable memory is not simply an interesting trait, it is a genuine survival tool, quietly doing its job every single night. Set that 3-year retention figure beside memory studies conducted on other mammals, and the comparison becomes genuinely striking. Many animals considerably larger and possessing considerably larger brains than a raccoon show memory retention for learned tasks measured in months rather than years, fading noticeably once training stops and enough time passes without reinforcement. A raccoon's ability to hold on to a solved problem for years, running counters any simple assumption that brain size alone predicts memory capacity. A reminder that cognitive ability depends heavily on how a brain is organized, not merely how large it happens to be. Researchers studying comparative cognition have increasingly moved away from ranking animal intelligence by brain size alone. precisely because results like this keep complicating that older, simpler framework. A raccoon's brain, though modest in overall size, appears to be organized with unusually efficient memory circuitry, at least for the kinds of physical hands-on problems this animal regularly encounters in the wild latches. Containers obstacles between itself and a meal. That efficiency likely reflects millions of years of selection, favoring raccoons that remembered which strategies worked at which locations, since forgetting a productive foraging site or a reliable den location could carry real survival costs. Long memory, in other words, is not simply a curious side effect of raccoon cognition. It may be one of the central reasons this particular problem-solving ability proves so useful in the first place. Most animal cognition studies test problem-solving using food as the reward, the assumption being that hunger, not curiosity, drives an animal to work through a mechanical puzzle in the first place. A 2026 study conducted by researchers at the University of British Columbia set out to test that assumption directly, presenting captive raccoons with puzzle boxes containing latches and compartments to manipulate, but this time deliberately leaving some of those boxes completely empty, offering no food reward whatsoever for solving them. The design was meant to isolate a genuinely difficult question in animal behavior. Research whether raccoons approach mechanical puzzles purely as a means to an end, or whether something closer to curiosity plays a role independent of any material payoff. Setting up that comparison required careful controls since researchers needed confidence that any interest shown toward the empty puzzles reflected genuine engagement with the problem itself rather than simple confusion or an animal searching in vain for food it expected to find. It was a fairly elegant experimental question, hunger versus curiosity, tested using the same basic mechanical puzzles. Raccoons had already proven across more than a century of research they were fully capable of solving under ordinary circumstances. What the raccoons did next surprised even researchers who already respected this animal's problem-solving reputation. Faced with puzzle boxes offering no food reward at all, the raccoons in that 2026 study kept working them. Anyway, manipulating latches and compartments with much the same persistence researchers had documented in food reward versions of similar tasks. That result ran directly against the simpler assumption that hunger alone drives this kind of behavior. Since an animal working purely for food should in theory quickly lose interest once it becomes clear no reward is coming. Instead, the raccoons continued engaging with the empty puzzles across repeated sessions, suggesting the act of solving the mechanism itself carried some value independent of whatever sat or did not sit inside. Researchers involved in the study were careful in how they described this finding, avoiding overreach about what the animals might be experiencing internally, but the behavioral pattern itself was clear and consistently repeated across multiple individual raccoons rather than a single outlier. It is worth sitting with how unusual that finding actually is within animal cognition research generally, since relatively few species have been shown to persist at genuinely difficult mechanical tasks without any material reward attached. Whatever is happening inside a raccoon's mind, while it works an empty puzzle box, something is clearly holding its attention there, and that something looks a great deal like the same restless curiosity that has this animal opening latched trash cans, storm sewer grates, and compost bins across an entire continent reward, or no reward at all. Put the pieces of that 2026 study together, and a broader picture starts to take shape, one that reframes a great deal of raccoon behavior discussed earlier in this program. If raccoons will work a mechanical puzzle even without a food reward waiting inside, then all those defeated trash cans and compost bins documented in city after city might reflect something more layered than simple hunger driving a desperate search for food. Some portion of that behavior may be genuinely exploratory, an animal drawn to test an unfamiliar mechanism, largely because it is unfamiliar, with the eventual food reward functioning as one motivation among several rather than the entire story. That distinction matters for how researchers and frankly the rest of us think about this species going forward. An animal solving problems purely out of hunger is a fairly simple creature to predict and in theory to deter, remove the food source, and the behavior should largely stop. An animal also solving problems out of something resembling curiosity is considerably harder to outsmart, since removing the food reward alone may not remove the underlying drive to investigate and manipulate whatever presents itself as a challenge. That single distinction, hunger-driven versus curiosity-driven, may explain a great deal about why raccoons keep defeating engineering solutions built specifically to stop them. An animal that seems to enjoy the puzzle almost as much as whatever. If anything happens to be waiting on the other side of it, return for a moment to that trash can standing in your driveway purchased with real confidence after reading about its reinforced latch and raccoon-resistant design. Everything covered across this last stretch of facts helps explain exactly why that confidence so often turns out to be misplaced. A raccoon approaching that can is not simply a hungry animal weighing whether the trouble of a locked lid is worth the potential reward inside. It is quite possibly an animal genuinely drawn to the mechanical challenge the latch itself represents, willing to keep testing and adjusting its approach well past the point where a purely hunger-driven creature might reasonably give up and move along to an easier target. Layer in that documented 3-year memory retention, and the picture sharpens further since a raccoon that finally cracks your particular latch design is likely to remember exactly how it did so for years afterward, returning with a solved problem already loaded and ready, rather than starting from scratch each visit. None of that makes the raccoon some kind of criminal mastermind plotting against homeowners specifically, of course. It simply means the animal on the other side of that latch is working with a genuinely capable, patient, curiosity-driven mind, backed by real memory and real persistence. Understanding that mind fully, though, requires looking beyond the individual raccoon, working alone at your trash can toward the social world it operates within, which is exactly where this story turns next. The same forepaw built to sweep through submerged mud for crayfish to pry a stubborn clam open or to tease a beetle out from beneath a rotting log turns out to be almost perfectly suited by pure coincidence for working the kind of latches and handles humans install on doors, coolers, and trash cans. Both tasks demand a similar combination of skills: enough finger independence to apply pressure at a specific point, enough tactile feedback to sense resistance and adjust in real time, and enough patience to keep working, a stubborn mechanism, rather than abandoning it after a single failed attempt. A wild raccoon prying open a mussel shell along a riverbank is essentially performing the same category of motion as a raccoon working a cooler latch on a suburban porch, applying targeted pressure, sensing where the resistance gives, and adjusting its grip accordingly. Human engineers designing locks and latches were not thinking about raccoons at all when they settled on these mechanisms, favoring simple hooks, sliding bolts, and lever-style handles, because they are easy for human hands to operate. It happens that many of those same basic mechanical principles leverage targeted pressure, sequential movement map almost directly onto skills a raccoon already perfected foraging along a creek bed thousands of generations before the first cooler latch was ever manufactured. The overlap was never intentional. It simply turned out to be extraordinarily convenient for one particular animal. Picture a raccoon working a stubborn clamshell along a muddy riverbank, forepaws braced against the shell's two halves, applying steady, targeted pressure at the hinge point until the resistance finally gives way and the shell pops open. Now picture that same animal a few months later working a metal cooler latch on someone's back porch, forepaws braced against the lever, applying that same kind of steady, targeted pressure until the latch finally releases. Biomechanically, these are close cousins of the same motion refined originally for prying open tightly sealed natural objects and repurposed almost without modification for defeating manufactured hardware built along similar mechanical principles. A gate hook presents a nearly identical challenge. A small metal loop resisting a specific angle of lift, solvable through the same combination of patience and targeted pressure a raccoon already applies constantly while foraging in the wild. This helps explain why raccoons seem to master certain human mechanisms so quickly compared to other wildlife, since the animal is not learning an entirely foreign skill from scratch. It is applying an already well-practiced foraging technique to a new kind of target, one that happens to be conveniently mounted on a cooler, a gate, or a garden shed, rather than embedded in a riverbed. The wilderness taught this animal everything it needed. The suburbs just gave it new places to use that education. For an animal, often described as solitary raccoons, maintain a social structure considerably more layered than that label suggests, particularly among females. Field studies, tracking raccoon movement and territory, have found that adult female raccoons frequently maintain home ranges that overlap significantly with those of their own daughters, as well as with other closely related females, forming loose clusters of kin occupying adjacent or shared territory across multiple generations. This is not the tight cooperative pack structure seen in wolves or the strict hierarchy documented in some primate societies. It is something looser and more informal, related females tolerating one another's presence within shared foraging grounds, occasionally denning in reasonably close proximity, and generally showing less territorial aggression toward kin than toward unrelated raccoons moving through the same area. Researchers describe raccoon social organization using the term matrilineal, meaning organized loosely around female family lines passed down through generations. A mother's territory gradually becoming the shared range of her adult daughters once they establish themselves nearby, rather than dispersing entirely. That structure likely offers real practical benefits. Familiar neighbors present less unpredictable competition than strangers would, and a young female establishing her first independent territory benefits considerably from settling somewhere already familiar near relatives she has known since birth, rather than negotiating entirely unknown ground alone. Beyond simply tolerating overlapping territory, related female raccoons have been documented occasionally denning together, particularly through the coldest stretches of winter, when shared body heat offers a genuine survival advantage. A mother and her grown daughters or several sister raccoons from the same earlier litter may settle into a single den for weeks at a time during harsh winter conditions, an arrangement that reduces individual energy expenditure at exactly the point in the year when energy reserves matter most. This kind of cooperative denning represents a meaningful departure from the raccoon's popular reputation as a strictly solitary animal, closer in spirit, though considerably looser in structure, to the communal winter denning documented in some other mammal species that otherwise live largely independent lives outside the coldest months. Resource sharing within these small kin groups appears to extend beyond simple warmth as well, with related females sometimes tolerating one another's presence around a particularly rich food source in ways they would not extend to an unrelated raccoon competing for the same territory. None of this amounts to true cooperative living in the way biologists use that term for genuinely social species. It is closer to a flexible kin-based safety net, activated mainly when conditions turn harsh enough to make sharing more valuable than solitude, then largely set aside again once warmer weather returns and each female resumes her more independent routine. Where female raccoons build loose, lasting kin networks across generations, males take a considerably different path. Adult male raccoons sometimes form small, temporary coalitions with other males, typically 2 to 4 individuals banding together for practical advantages like improved defense of foraging territory or better odds during confrontations with rival males, particularly during the breeding season when competition for mates intensifies. These male alliances tend to be far less stable than the female kin networks discussed earlier, shifting composition over time and sometimes dissolving entirely once the immediate advantage that formed them, contested territory, a mating opportunity, has passed. Researchers studying raccoon social behavior describe these coalitions as functional rather than deeply bonded, closer to a temporary business partnership than genuine family loyalty, useful while circumstances favor cooperation and easily abandoned once they no longer do. Unlike females, male raccoons typically disperse considerable distances from where they were born once reaching maturity, which likely explains why their social bonds tend to form based on convenience and shared opportunity rather than blood relation the way female networks do. It is a fairly practical arrangement, cooperation without deep commitment useful precisely because it can be entered into or abandoned quickly as circumstances shift. For an animal built around flexibility in nearly every other aspect of its life, that same flexible approach extends naturally into how it manages relationships with other males. Raising a litter of raccoon kits is a considerably longer commitment than the roughly 10 weeks it takes to wean them might suggest. A mother raccoon continues actively teaching her young for close to a full year after birth, guiding them through an extended education in exactly what this landscape offers, which foods are safe and worth the effort, where reliable water, a team source, sit, which denning spots offer real shelter, and which routes through the territory avoid unnecessary risk. That teaching period stretches well past physical independence, since kits are capable of basic movement and feeding themselves considerably earlier than a full year. Yet mother raccoons continue keeping the litter together and actively involved in nightly foraging trips regardless. This extended investment reflects just how much raccoon survival depends on learned knowledge rather than pure instinct alone, since a young raccoon separated from its mother too early would be missing crucial hard-won information about the specific patch of territory it needs to survive in. Information no amount of built-in instinct alone could fully replace. Wildlife rehabilitators raising orphaned kits without a mother present consistently report that these animals face steeper survival challenges once released back into the wild, lacking exactly this kind of first-hand territory-specific education. A raccoon's remarkable adaptability, it turns out, is not purely inherited. A meaningful share of it gets taught patiently night after night, across nearly the entire first year of life. Picture a small procession moving through a backyard. Well after dark, a mother raccoon leading the way, with 2 or 3 kits trailing close behind, pausing when she pauses, investigating what she investigates, absorbing the specific geography of their shared territory, one night at a time. This direct observation learning forms the backbone of a raccoon kit's education. Watching exactly which fallen logs its mother checks for grubs, which yards reliably offer unsecured trash, which creek bends hold the richest crayfish, and committing that specific local knowledge to memory through repeated first-hand exposure rather than any kind of instinctive shortcut. Researchers studying mammal learning generally describe this process as social learning, knowledge transmitted between individuals through observation rather than through genetics alone, and raccoons appear to rely on it heavily during this extended juvenile period. That reliance helps explain why raccoon behavior can vary meaningfully between neighboring territories, populations, or even individual family lines, since each mother is effectively passing down a locally tailored survival guide built from her own accumulated experience navigating that specific patch of ground. A kit raised by a mother experienced at raiding suburban trash cans is likely to grow into an adult skilled at exactly that. A kit raised by a mother focused primarily on wetland foraging is likely to develop a different specialty entirely. The territory teaches the mother patiently teaches the kit. A growing body of research into urban wildlife has begun, asking a genuinely interesting question about raccoons specifically. Is city living actively reshaping the population, favoring individuals with particular behavioral traits over others, generation after generation? Several researchers studying urban and suburban raccoon populations have proposed that city environments may be selecting for bolder, faster-learning individuals, animals more willing to approach unfamiliar objects, more comfortable navigating close proximity to humans, and quicker to adapt novel strategies for accessing food. The reasoning behind this hypothesis is fairly straightforward. A raccoon too cautious to investigate a new type of trash can, or too easily startled by human activity, may simply access less food and raise fewer surviving offspring in a dense urban environment compared to a bolder, quicker learning neighbor working the exact same block. Over enough generations, that kind of pressure could gradually shift the overall behavioral profile of an urban population. Even without any change to the underlying physical traits researchers might more easily measure. This remains an active area of ongoing research rather than a fully settled conclusion, since separating genuine evolutionary selection from simple behavioral learning passed down through direct teaching, the same kind of mother-to-kit education just described, is genuinely difficult to untangle in a wild population. Still, the hypothesis fits neatly alongside everything else this program has already covered about raccoon success in cities, hinting that urban life may be actively sharpening this animal further with each passing generation. Testing that boldness hypothesis directly, several field studies have presented raccoons from both urban and rural populations with unfamiliar objects, novel containers, unusual latches, items the animals had never previously encountered then, measured how quickly each group approached and investigated. The pattern across multiple such studies has been fairly consistent. Urban raccoons tend to approach unfamiliar objects considerably more readily than their rural counterparts, showing less hesitation and a shorter delay before beginning to investigate. Rural raccoons in these same studies often display more caution around novel items, a response that makes reasonable sense in an environment where unfamiliar objects appearing suddenly might reasonably signal danger rather than opportunity. Urban raccoons, by contrast, encounter genuinely novel objects on a near constant basis, simply as part of ordinary city life. New trash can designs, unfamiliar packaging, unusual construction materials, which may condition individual animals over their lifetimes to treat novelty as routine rather than alarming. Whether that difference reflects genuine hereditary selection, building bolder animals over generations, or simply individual learning shaped by a lifetime spent surrounded by unfamiliar objects, remains a genuinely open scientific question. Either explanation, though, points toward the same practical outcome: a population of city raccoons measurably more willing to walk straight up to whatever new obstacle happens to stand between them and dinner, compared to raccoons living a comparatively quieter life out in the countryside. Untangling nature from nurture in this particular case has proven genuinely difficult for researchers, and the honest answer at this point leans toward some combination of both rather than a clean single explanation. A raccoon kit raised entirely in an urban environment is exposed from its very first nights of independent foraging to a near constant stream of unfamiliar object sounds and human activity conditions that likely shape its behavior considerably, regardless of whatever genetic tendencies it inherited from its parents. That kind of early repeated exposure to novelty could plausibly produce a bolder adult raccoon purely through individual learning and habituation, no inherited trait required at all. At the same time, if bolder individual raccoons genuinely do raise more surviving offspring in city environments, as researchers exploring the selection hypothesis have proposed, then some degree of hereditary shift across generations remains entirely plausible as well, layered on top of whatever individual learning also contributes. Most researchers studying this question currently favor a blended explanation, acknowledging that both mechanisms likely operate simultaneously rather than treating it as a strict either-or question. What remains clear, regardless of the precise mechanism driving it, is the observed outcome itself: urban raccoons behaving in measurably bolder, more exploratory ways than their rural relatives. Exactly how much of that difference traces back to genetics versus upbringing remains one of the more compelling open questions in ongoing raccoon research. Weigh a raccoon's brain against its overall body size, and the ratio looks fairly unremarkable at first glance, smaller relative to body mass than what researchers find in many primates, and not dramatically different from ratios documented in other mid-sized carnivores. Simple brain-to-body ratio, though, has increasingly fallen out of favor among researchers as a reliable predictor of intelligence precisely because it misses details that seem to matter considerably more, like how densely packed with neurons a given brain actually is, and how those neurons are organized across different functional regions. Preliminary research into raccoon neuroanatomy suggests a notably high neuron density in certain regions, though comprehensive, directly comparative neuron counts across species remain an active and ongoing area of study rather than a fully settled body of data. What researchers can say with more confidence based on the behavioral evidence covered throughout this program: memory retention spanning years, rapid mechanical problem solving, apparent curiosity-driven persistence, is that raw brain size alone clearly fails to capture whatever is actually happening inside this animal's skull. A raccoon appears to be punching well above its anatomical weight class, cognitively speaking. A mismatch that has genuinely puzzled researchers accustomed to using brain size as a rough proxy for capability. Precisely how that gap gets bridged through neuron density organization or some combination not yet fully understood remains one of the more compelling unanswered questions still surrounding this animal's biology. Draw a line from Lawrence Cole's hand-built wooden locks in the early 1900s straight through to captive raccoons methodically working empty puzzle boxes in a Colorado research facility in 2026. More than a century of research keeps arriving at essentially the same conclusion through very different methods. This is an animal capable of learning multi-step mechanical solutions, quickly retaining those solutions for years without practice, adapting flexibly when a familiar problem appears in an unfamiliar form, and apparently engaging with difficult puzzles for reasons that go beyond simple hunger alone. Layer in a social structure sophisticated enough to maintain multi-generational female kin networks and flexible male coalitions, plus nearly a full year of patient direct maternal teaching passed to each new litter, and the picture shifts considerably from the simple image of a clever trash bandit this program opened with. What emerges instead is a mind genuinely built for improvisation. Quick to learn, slow to forget, curious enough to keep working a problem after the practical reward has already been secured. That mind is precisely what allowed a modest forest omnivore to walk into an entirely engineered human landscape: storm sewers, air ducts, reinforced trash cans, sound barriers, and treat nearly every obstacle as simply one more lock waiting to be solved. Understanding that intelligence sets up the next question naturally: just how far this remarkable animal's reach and numbers actually extend across the wider world. After nearly a full year spent as an independent roaming adult, a raccoon's biological clock resets each winter around the same seasonal rhythm that has governed the species for generations. Mating season generally runs from late winter into early summer, with activity typically peaking sometime around February across much of the raccoon's range. Though the exact timing shifts somewhat depending on latitude and local climate, occurring somewhat later in colder northern regions than in milder southern ones. During this window, male raccoons expand their normal home range considerably, traveling well beyond their usual territory, specifically in search of receptive females. A temporary departure from the more settled routine they maintain the rest of the year. Females, meanwhile, generally remain within their established territory, allowing males to come to them rather than actively seeking out mates themselves. This seasonal timing is not arbitrary. Raccoons have evolved a mating window carefully calibrated so that the resulting litters arrive in spring, precisely when weather conditions ease and food becomes considerably more abundant, giving newborn kits the best possible start heading into their first summer of growth. It is a rhythm timed by instinct rather than calendar, yet it lines up with remarkable consistency year after year, an old biological clock still running exactly on schedule, regardless of how much the surrounding landscape, forest, or city block has changed around it. Once mating concludes, a male raccoon's involvement in the process ends there completely and permanently. He does not return to help defend a den, does not assist with feeding, and typically has no further contact whatsoever with either the female or any resulting offspring. A pattern common across many solitary mammal species, but still worth stating plainly, given how differently some other animals handle parental duties. The entire burden of raising a litter from pregnancy, through nearly a full year of active teaching discussed earlier in this program, falls exclusively on the mother, who manages pregnancy, birth, nursing, protection, and education without any direct partner support at any stage of that lengthy process. That arrangement places considerable demands on a single animal, since she must continue foraging enough to sustain both herself and eventually a litter of hungry kits, all while remaining alert to genuine threats. A den full of vulnerable young inevitably attracts. It is worth pausing on the sheer scale of that solo commitment: one animal managing an entire year's worth of child-rearing responsibilities without assistance, defense, or backup of any kind. Nature in this particular arrangement asks a great deal of the female raccoon specifically, and by every available measure she consistently delivers, raising generation after generation of capable young, essentially single-handedly, using nothing more than instinct, experience, and whatever territory she has managed to secure for herself. A raccoon's pregnancy runs remarkably close to 63 days from conception to birth, a span that happens to align almost exactly with the gestation period of a domestic house cat, a comparison that offers most listeners an immediate familiar frame of reference even without ever having watched a raccoon litter arrive firsthand. That roughly 2-month window is considerably shorter than what many larger mammals require, reflecting the raccoon's overall reproductive strategy of producing a litter of several small, relatively underdeveloped young rather than investing a longer pregnancy into fewer, more developed offspring. During those 2 months, the expectant mother continues largely normal activity, foraging and moving through her territory much as usual until the final stretch approaches, at which point she begins seeking out and preparing an appropriate den site, evaluating hollow trees, rock crevices, or increasingly the kinds of human structures already covered earlier in this program: attics, chimneys, sheltered crawl spaces, The consistency of that 63-day window across the species offers wildlife biologists a fairly reliable tool for predicting birth timing based on observed mating activity, useful for researchers tracking population dynamics or timing field studies around den sites. It is a short, efficient pregnancy by mammalian standards. One more small piece of a reproductive strategy built entirely around speed, flexibility, and getting a new generation up and moving as quickly as reasonably possible. When a raccoon litter finally arrives, the newborns bear almost no resemblance to the capable, dexterous animals they will eventually become. A typical litter numbers somewhere between 2 and 5 kits, born with their eyes and ears both sealed shut, essentially blind and deaf to the world around them, and possessing barely enough muscle control to do much more than wriggle toward their mother's warmth and nurse. That helpless starting point stands in sharp contrast to everything covered earlier in this program. The mechanical puzzle solving the extended memory, the confident nighttime navigation of entire city blocks, none of which exists yet in any recognizable form inside these first fragile days. Each kit weighs only a few ounces at birth, light enough to rest easily in a single human hand, entirely dependent on their mother for warmth, nutrition, and basic protection from a den environment that, however carefully chosen, still carries real risks for animals this vulnerable. The gap between a newborn kit and a mature, capable adult raccoon is genuinely vast, and closing that gap requires nearly the entire first year of patient development. This program has already traced sense by sense, skill by skill. It is worth remembering the next time a raccoon confidently defeats a latched trash can that the very same animal once began life unable to see here, or do much of anything at all beyond seeking out its mother's warmth. Picture holding a newborn raccoon kit for the first time, something wildlife rehabilitators occasionally do when orphaned litters require hand-rearing, and the overwhelming first impression is simply how little the animal actually weighs. Typically just a few ounces, comparable to holding a stick of butter, or perhaps a small bar of soap, rather than anything resembling the sturdy, confident adult raccoon most people picture when they hear the word. That tiny starting weight will multiply dramatically over the coming months, since an adult raccoon typically weighs somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 pounds, depending on season and individual, meaning a kit may grow to roughly 50 times its birth weight or more by full maturity. An enormous scaling factor achieved within a relatively short window of 1 to 2 years. Achieving that growth requires steady, high-quality nutrition from the very start, which is precisely why nursing dominates the earliest weeks of a kit's life almost completely before gradually giving way to the solid food foraging. Lessons covered earlier in this program. Wildlife rehabilitators raising orphaned kits without a mother present must replicate that intensive early feeding schedule, carefully understanding just how much growth these tiny animals need to accomplish in a relatively compressed time frame. From a creature light enough to cup in one hand to an animal capable of prying open a cooler latch or outsmarting a research puzzle box. The raccoon's growth curve packs an enormous transformation into a remarkably short span. For roughly the first 3 weeks of life, a raccoon kid experiences its entire world through touch, smell, and sound alone, its eyes remaining completely sealed shut during this early developmental window, much like the kittens and puppies. Many listeners have likely raised themselves at some point. That extended period of blindness might sound like a significant vulnerability, and in some respects it is, but it also allows the kit's nervous system additional time to develop before visual information starts flooding, in a common pattern across many mammal species that give birth to relatively underdeveloped young. Once those eyes finally do open, typically somewhere around the 3-week mark, the kit begins gradually piecing together a visual picture of its den. Soon after, the world immediately surrounding it, though. Genuine confident vision, along with the coordinated movement needed to act on what it sees, still takes additional weeks to fully develop. This gradual awakening mirrors in miniature the broader theme running throughout raccoon development, generally capability, arriving in careful stages rather than all at once. Each new sense or skill building upon a foundation the previous weeks have already established. By the time those eyes fully adjust to actual sight, the kid is also beginning to explore slightly beyond its mother's immediate side. For the first time, a small, cautious preview of the far more extensive nightly foraging education, still waiting several weeks further down the road. Around the 10-week mark, a raccoon litter reaches a genuine turning point, transitioning from nursing dependence into young animals actively beginning to travel alongside their mother during her nightly foraging rounds. Weaning does not happen instantly at this stage, more a gradual shift over several weeks, as solid food increasingly supplements and eventually replaces nursing entirely. But by roughly 10 weeks, kits are generally capable of eating solid food and have begun the direct observation education already described earlier in this program. Following their mother watching, where she forages and slowly building the location-specific knowledge they will need for eventual independence. This stage marks the kit's first real exposure to the wider territory beyond the immediate den, a considerable expansion after 10 weeks spent almost entirely confined to a single sheltered spot. It is also, from the mother's perspective, a period demanding heightened vigilance since a litter of curious, still relatively inexperienced kits, moving through open territory, faces genuine risks from predators, vehicles in urban settings, and simple accidents that more experienced adults would typically avoid. The transition from den-bound infant to traveling juvenile happens on a fairly predictable schedule across the species, but the actual experience, tiny kits stumbling along behind their mother through unfamiliar terrain for the very first time, remains one of the more genuinely endearing stages in this animal's otherwise fairly rough and tumble developmental journey. Rather than scattering once weaned, a raccoon litter typically remains together as a cohesive family unit straight through their first winter, continuing to den alongside their mother, and in many cases alongside one another as well past the point where they are technically capable of surviving independently. That extended togetherness serves a clear, practical purpose. Since winter represents the single most demanding stretch any raccoon will face in its first year, and a young animal navigating its very first cold season benefits considerably from remaining close to a mother whose accumulated experience already covers exactly this challenge. Shared denning through winter also offers the same warmth conservation advantage discussed earlier regarding related adult females, several bodies sharing a single sheltered space, retaining heat more efficiently than any one animal, managing entirely alone. This arrangement means a raccoon's first winter looks considerably less isolated than the species' solitary adult reputation might suggest. A mother and her nearly full-grown litter, still moving and denning together as a small family group even as the young approach roughly 9 to 10 months of age. That family structure will not last much longer past this point, spring dispersal waiting just a few months further down the calendar but through the hardest stretch of the year. Staying together clearly outweighs whatever advantages an earlier, more solitary independence might otherwise offer. Once winter finally breaks and warmer weather returns, the tight family unit that carried a raccoon litter through its first cold season begins to dissolve, typically within a matter of weeks, as spring settles in fully. Young raccoons by this point, approaching roughly a year old and having absorbed nearly 12 months of direct maternal education, begin dispersing from their mother's territory to establish independent home ranges of their own. That dispersal plays out somewhat differently between the sexes. Echoing patterns already discussed earlier in this program, young females often settling relatively close to their mother's existing territory, sometimes establishing a home range that overlaps considerably with hers, gradually building toward exactly the kind of multi-generational female kin network described earlier. Young males, by contrast, typically disperse considerably further, sometimes traveling many miles beyond their birth territory before settling, a pattern that likely helps prevent inbreeding within these loosely connected local populations, while also explaining why male social bonds tend to form through convenience rather than blood relation. This spring scattering marks the effective end of one raccoon generation's direct dependence and the true beginning of full independence. Each young animal, now navigating an unfamiliar stretch of territory, using nothing more than the accumulated lessons absorbed across that first demanding year. Within months, several of these newly independent yearlings will themselves be old enough to begin the entire cycle over again. Not every landscape treats a raccoon equally well, and open prairie represents something close to the lean end of that spectrum. Wildlife surveys conducted across prairie habitat have documented raccoon densities falling below one animal per square kilometer. In some areas, a genuinely sparse population by this species' standards, reflecting the relative scarcity of the water sources, dense cover, and varied food availability that raccoons generally depend on most heavily. Open grassland simply lacks several of the resources this animal relies on. Elsewhere, fewer hollow trees for denning, less reliable water access across the full landscape, and a narrower range of foraging opportunities compared to forest, wetland, or urban settings covered elsewhere in this program. That sparse density stands in sharp contrast to figures discussed shortly, from the richest natural wetland habitat all the way through to dense urban neighborhoods, and the comparison across that full range helps illustrate just how dramatically raccoon population numbers can swing based purely on habitat quality. A raccoon can certainly survive on open prairie, and does, but it does so at a fraction of the density this same species achieves in landscapes better suited to its particular combination of needs. Understanding that low baseline sets up a genuinely striking comparison, since the numbers waiting on the opposite end of that spectrum climb to a scale that is difficult to picture without a concrete, familiar image to anchor them. Move from open prairie into rich lowland forest or marshland, and the raccoon population figures climb dramatically, sometimes exceeding 20 animals within that same single square kilometer that supported less than one out on the prairie. Lowland forest and marsh habitat offer nearly everything this animal favors in concentrated abundance: reliable water, dense denning cover in hollow trees and thick undergrowth, and a rich, varied food supply, spanning crayfish, amphibians, fruit nuts, and small prey animals, all within a compact, easily traveled area. That 20-fold difference between prairie and prime wetland habitat is not a small variation. It represents one of the more dramatic examples of habitat-driven population swing documented in any North American mammal, a single species capable of thriving at wildly different densities, depending almost entirely on what the surrounding landscape happens to offer. Researchers studying raccoon ecology have long used lowland forest and marsh habitat as something close to a baseline for the species' true potential, the closest approximation available to what an ideal, undisturbed raccoon habitat actually looks like. That baseline matters considerably for the comparison still to come, since it establishes just how rich an environment needs to be before it can rival what many raccoons apparently now find without even trying particularly hard in an ordinary American neighborhood. Here is where the comparison becomes genuinely remarkable. Some dense urban and suburban neighborhoods studied directly by wildlife researchers tracking raccoon populations now support densities that rival, and in certain documented cases exceed, the figures recorded in the richest natural wetland habitat just described the closest thing to a raccoon paradise the wild world has to offer. That finding represents a significant departure from how wildlife biologists traditionally expected development to affect native species, since the standard assumption holds that converting natural habitat into housing and pavement should reduce, not match or exceed, a species' population potential. Raccoons have apparently found a way around that expectation almost entirely, treating an older residential neighborhood mature. Shade trees, accessible water sources, unsecured trash, scattered pet food left on porches as functionally equivalent to, or in some cases better than, the richest wetland forest researchers can measure. That equivalence did not happen by accident. It reflects every single advantage covered across this program so far, layered together in one place. The dexterous hands, the curiosity-driven problem solving, the flexible diet, the willingness to den in nearly any sheltered structure. An ordinary residential block, in other words, has quietly become one of the single best places on the entire continent for a raccoon to make a living, no wetland required. Numbers alone can be difficult to hold on to, so consider a more direct comparison. A single square mile of open prairie, roughly 640 acres of land, might support somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 or 3 raccoons total, given the sparse density figures already discussed for that habitat type. Meanwhile, a single dense urban block, an area that might contain a few dozen houses and cover only a small fraction of an acre, can, in the right circumstances, support a comparable number of raccoons, living, denning, and foraging within that dramatically smaller footprint. Picture standing at one end of a 640-acre stretch of open grassland, walking its entire length and width, and encountering perhaps 2 or 3 raccoons across that whole vast expanse. Now picture standing on an ordinary residential street corner and realizing that the same rough number of raccoons might be denning within eyesight, tucked into a handful of nearby yards, attics, and storm drains. That is the scale of difference habitat quality can produce for this particular species. An animal capable of squeezing the population density of an entire square mile of prairie into a space smaller than most public parks, simply because the surrounding human landscape happens to offer everything it needs concentrated and close together, rather than scattered thin across open ground. Zoom out from any single neighborhood or habitat type, and the raccoon's native range alone tells a story of remarkable adaptability, spanning an enormous stretch of the Western Hemisphere. This species occurs naturally from southern Canada, tolerating genuinely harsh northern winters all the way down through the entire continental United States, and continuing further still through Mexico and Central America into Panama, where the northern raccoon's range meets that of a related species, the crab-eating raccoon found further south still. That native span covers an extraordinary range of climates and ecosystems: subarctic forest, temperate woodland, arid scrubland, tropical lowland, each demanding a somewhat different survival strategy. And the raccoon manages all of them using essentially the same basic toolkit covered throughout this program: dexterous hands, flexible diet, adaptable denning habits, and genuine behavioral intelligence. Few North American mammals can claim a natural range extending across quite this many distinct climate zones without some meaningful degree of physical or behavioral specialization along the way. The raccoon largely skips that specialization, relying instead on generalized adaptability to handle whatever a given region happens to demand. That native range alone already represents a considerable geographic success story. What makes the raccoon's spread genuinely unusual, though, is that this extensive native range turned out to be only the beginning of the story, not the end of it. In the 1930s, German fur farmers imported raccoons from North America, drawn by the value of raccoon pelts within the broader fur trade of that era, establishing captive breeding operations intended purely for commercial fur production rather than any deliberate plan to introduce a wild population into the European landscape. As often happens with captive wildlife operations, some animals escaped these facilities over the following years, whether through enclosure failures, deliberate releases, or simple oversight, establishing a small foothold of wild raccoons living free within German forests and countryside. What began as an unintended handful of escaped animals did not stay small for long, since the same adaptability and reproductive success already covered extensively throughout this program applied just as effectively in an unfamiliar European landscape as it had across the raccoon's native North American range. German wildlife authorities, initially treating the situation as a minor curiosity involving a small, contained population, gradually found themselves managing something considerably larger as decades passed, and that original escaped population expanded well beyond its initial foothold. This pattern, an animal imported for one narrow commercial purpose, escaping captivity, and subsequently establishing a thriving wild population far outside its native range, is a familiar story across invasive species history generally. Few examples, though, illustrate the raccoon's particular talent for turning a small opening into a lasting foothold quite as clearly as Germany's experience did. Nearly a century after that initial 1930s fur farm escape, the wild raccoon population, descended from those original animals, has grown into a genuinely substantial presence across German forests and countryside with wildlife. Researchers estimating the current population somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of individuals, spread across large stretches of the country and continuing to expand into neighboring regions of Europe. That kind of growth, from a small handful of escaped fur farm animals to a population numbering in the hundreds of thousands within roughly 90 years, illustrates the same reproductive and adaptive success already covered throughout this program, simply transplanted onto an entirely different continent with no prior evolutionary history involving raccoons at all. German wildlife management now treats the raccoon as a well-established, if still somewhat controversial part of the country's wildlife landscape, with researchers monitoring its ecological impact on native European species that never evolved alongside a predator quite like this one. Some regions have implemented hunting programs specifically aimed at managing raccoon numbers, treating the species similarly to how North American wildlife agencies manage historically native populations. An odd inversion given the animal's originally foreign status. What started as a narrow commercial fur venture nearly a century ago has become one of the more striking examples of a single species successfully establishing itself on an entirely new continent, purely through the same adaptability that has already carried it across so much of its native range and into so many American cities besides. Decades after Germany's fur farm escape, a strikingly similar pattern unfolded on the opposite side of the world, driven this time not by the fur trade but by the pet industry. Following the popularity of a 1970s Japanese animated television series featuring a raccoon character, demand for raccoons as household pets surged considerably across Japan, leading to the import of large numbers of live animals from North America to meet that demand. Raccoons, however, tend to make genuinely difficult pets once they reach adulthood, retaining the same curiosity, dexterity, and problem-solving persistence covered throughout this program, traits considerably less charming in a household setting than they had appeared in a young, more manageable kit. As many of these pet raccoons matured into animals, their owners found increasingly difficult to manage. A meaningful number were either deliberately released or managed to escape into the surrounding Japanese countryside, echoing the same basic pattern that had already played out in Germany decades earlier. Japan, much like Central Europe before it, had no native raccoon population and no existing ecological relationship with the species, meaning the escaped and released animals encountered a landscape offering abundant opportunity and remarkably little in the way of established competition or predation pressure. The consequences of that pet trade boom would take several more decades to fully reveal themselves, but the foundation for Japan's own significant wild raccoon population had by this point already been firmly established. A common assumption holds that any mammal capable of tolerating genuinely harsh winter conditions must hibernate through the coldest stretches the way a woodchuck or a ground squirrel does, dropping body temperature dramatically and entering a deep, sustained state of metabolic slowdown for months at a time. Raccoons, despite thriving across some genuinely brutal northern winters, do not actually hibernate in that true biological sense at all. True hibernation involves dramatic sustained drops in both body temperature and metabolic rate, often lasting continuously for weeks or months without the animal waking, feeding, or moving around at all during that entire span. A raccoon's winter strategy looks considerably different and considerably less extreme than that description, involving periods of reduced activity and extended sleep, rather than the kind of deep, sustained metabolic shutdown a true hibernator experiences. This distinction matters more than it might first appear, since it means a raccoon remains capable of waking and moving around relatively quickly if conditions or circumstances demand it, unlike a true hibernator, which would require a considerably longer, more gradual process to rouse fully from its deepest winter state. That flexibility during winter fits neatly alongside everything else this program has already established about the species, an animal that tends to favor adaptable, responsive strategies over rigid, extreme ones, even when it comes to something as fundamental as surviving the coldest months of the year. What a raccoon actually experiences through winter is more accurately described as torpor, a lighter, considerably less extreme cousin of true hibernation, involving extended sleep and reduced activity, while body temperature remains far closer to normal than a true hibernator's would during its deepest winter state. During particularly harsh cold snaps or heavy snow cover, a raccoon may remain denned and largely inactive for stretches lasting anywhere from several days to a few weeks, relying entirely on that carefully built autumn fat reserve discussed earlier in this program to sustain itself through periods when venturing out to forage would cost more energy than it could realistically recover. Once conditions ease even slightly, a warmer stretch, a break in heavy snow cover, a raccoon in torpor can rouse itself relatively quickly and resume normal nighttime activity, a flexibility genuinely unavailable to true hibernating species, locked into a much longer, more rigid, seasonal cycle. This middle ground strategy, neither fully active through winter nor fully shut down the way a hibernator would be, represents yet another example of the adaptable, responsive approach running through nearly every aspect of raccoon biology already covered across this program. It allows the animal to weather genuinely difficult stretches without fully committing to the kind of extreme, months-long metabolic shutdown that would leave it unable to respond quickly should conditions inside or around its winter den suddenly change. The true cost of surviving winter through torpor rather than deep hibernation becomes clear once spring finally arrives and researchers get a chance to weigh raccoons that have made it through a genuinely hard season. In particularly harsh winters, a raccoon can emerge, having lost close to half of the body weight it carried heading into autumn. A dramatic swing considering that same animal had packed on close to a third of its body weight in fat just months earlier, precisely in preparation for exactly this kind of seasonal drawdown. Picture a person who weighed 150 pounds heading into November, emerging in March, weighing closer to 80, and the scale of that seasonal transformation becomes difficult to overstate. An enormous physical toll carried almost entirely by internal fat reserves rather than any external food source through the leanest stretches of the coldest months. That dramatic weight swing represents the real tangible price of choosing flexibility over deep hibernation. Since a raccoon's body continues burning meaningful energy through winter torpor in a way a true hibernator's radically slowed metabolism largely avoids. It is a demanding annual cycle feast through autumn's steady drawdown through winter and a considerably leaner animal emerging once spring finally breaks. That entire yearly rhythm, repeated without fail across the whole of a raccoon's short life, sets the stage for a final wider question. This program now turns toward where this remarkable animal actually fits within the broader natural world it has so thoroughly mastered. Step back from the raccoon as an individual animal, and it becomes worth asking where exactly it fits within the broader family tree of mammals it belongs to. Raccoons sit within the family Procyon, a relatively small group of mostly Central and South American mammals that also includes Codus, long-nosed, highly social animals, often seen foraging in groups through Latin American forests. Kinkajous tree-dwelling relatives, known for a prehensile tail. The raccoon itself never evolved, and ringtails smaller, slender cousins found across the American Southwest that share the raccoon's ringed tail pattern without sharing, nearly its size or bulk. Compared to many other mammal families, Procyonidae remains fairly compact, a modest handful of related genera, rather than the sprawling diversity found in families like the cats or the weasels. Within that smaller family, the raccoon stands out as by far the largest and most widely distributed member. Its closest relatives generally confined to considerably narrower geographic ranges, and in most cases showing far less tolerance for cold northern climates. That contrast is worth sitting with, since it means the raccoon's cousins, despite sharing a common ancestor and many underlying anatomical traits, largely stayed put within the warmer regions where the family likely first took shape, while the raccoon alone pushed outward north, and eventually, across entire oceans into territory none of its relatives ever managed to claim for themselves. The Procyonidae family did not appear recently on the evolutionary timeline. Fossil evidence places the earliest known members of this family at roughly 25 million years old, dating back to the late Oligocene epoch, a stretch of prehistory so far removed from the present that it predates not only modern humans, but every earlier hominid ancestor as well, by a truly enormous margin. Interestingly, some of the earliest fossil evidence for this family comes not from the Americas at all, but from sites in Europe suggesting the group's origins may trace back to a very different part of the world before eventually establishing itself firmly across North and South America, where its modern members are found almost exclusively today. That 25 million year span means the basic raccoon body plan, the dexterous forepaws, the flexible omnivorous diet, the general size and build has had an enormous amount of evolutionary time to refine itself against changing climates, shifting continents, and countless now extinct competitor species long since vanished from the fossil record. Picture the raccoon's most distant recognizable ancestors padding through ancient forests that existed while much of the modern world's mountain ranges, oceans, and climate patterns were still taking their current shape. Very few mammal lineages currently thriving in modern American backyards can trace their ancestry back quite that far. A genuinely deep evolutionary history hiding behind an animal most people encounter only briefly and usually at night, rummaging through an ordinary suburban trash can. One persistent point of confusion deserves direct correction here. The animal known as the raccoon dog, native to East Asia, and also established as an invasive species across parts of Europe, shares a strikingly similar facial mask and ringed tail pattern with the true raccoon, similar enough that the two are frequently mistaken for close relatives, or even for the same species by casual observers. They are not closely related at all. The raccoon dog belongs to the canid family, the same broad group that includes wolves, foxes, and domestic dogs, making it genetically closer to a fox than to any raccoon. Despite the strikingly similar coloring the two species happen to share. This is a clear case of convergent evolution, a pattern where two entirely unrelated species independently develop remarkably similar physical traits, because those traits happen to solve similar survival problems. In this instance, a dark facial mask likely serving a similar glare-reducing function in both animals and a ringed tail pattern, potentially aiding visibility or camouflage in both cases as well. Nature, faced with a similar set of environmental pressures on two separate continents, and within two entirely separate mammal families, arrived at a remarkably similar visual answer twice independently, without either species ever influencing others' evolution in any direct way. It stands as a genuinely useful reminder that shared appearance alone tells you far less about actual ancestry than most casual observation would ever suggest. Convergent evolution, the pattern responsible for the raccoon and raccoon dog resemblance just described, shows up across the natural world more often than most people realize, and it is worth dwelling on briefly here because it reframes how to think about several of the raccoon's most recognizable features. The masked face likely evolved independently in both lineages because glare reduction genuinely benefits any nocturnal forager operating in dim reflective conditions, regardless of which broader family that forager happens to belong to. The ringed tail pattern may have emerged separately in both animals for similar reasons as well, whether for visibility between individuals in low light, a function proposed earlier regarding raccoon kits, tracking their mother, or some other shared advantage. Neither species needed to borrow from the other to discover on its own. This kind of independent convergence offers a useful window into how evolution actually works, less a single fixed path toward one correct design, and more a landscape of genuinely good solutions that different lineages can stumble onto separately, given similar enough pressures and similar enough starting materials to work with. The raccoon did not invent the masked, ringed-tail nocturnal forager blueprint uniquely. It simply happens to be on this particular continent, the most successful and visible example of a design that nature has apparently found worth arriving at more than once, entirely independently, roughly 6,000 miles apart. Within the broader structure of any ecosystem, it inhabits. The raccoon occupies a position ecologists refer to as a mesopredator, a mid-level predator that hunts smaller prey, while simultaneously remaining vulnerable to predation from larger carnivores above it in the food chain. That middle position shapes a great deal of raccoon behavior and ecology, since the species must balance active hunting and foraging against genuine ongoing risk from larger predators like coyotes and historically wolves and mountain lions across parts of its range. Mesopredators generally play an outsized ecological role precisely because of this middle position, exerting real pressure on the smaller prey species below them while simultaneously being kept in check, at least in intact ecosystems, by the larger predators above. That balance matters enormously for overall ecosystem health, since removing either end of that chain, the larger predators keeping mesopredator numbers in check, or the smaller prey species mesopredators depend on, can send ripple effects, cascading through an entire local food web in ways that are not always immediately obvious. The raccoon's position within that chain is not a passive one either. Its own hunting and foraging behavior actively shapes the population dynamics of numerous smaller species sharing its habitat, a genuine ecological influence, extending well beyond the simple image of an opportunistic scavenger, rummaging through whatever happens to be available on a given night. That mesopredator role carries real, measurable consequences for other species. Sharing raccoon habitat and ground-nesting birds have proven particularly vulnerable to the pressure a dense raccoon population can exert. Studies tracking songbird nesting success in areas with high raccoon density have documented meaningfully increased rates of nest predation, eggs and young chicks consumed by raccoons before they ever have the chance to fledge, contributing in some documented cases to measurable local declines in ground-nesting bird populations. This connection matters considerably to wildlife managers and conservationists working to protect vulnerable bird species. Since raccoon predation frequently ranks among the significant factors contributing to nesting failure in certain habitats alongside other pressures like habitat loss and competition from other predators. It is worth noting that raccoons are not acting maliciously or unusually in this role, simply following the same opportunistic foraging instincts already covered extensively throughout this program. A nest full of eggs representing an accessible nutritious food source, no different in principle from a crayfish or a piece of fala fruit. Still, the ecological consequence remains real regardless of the raccoon's own neutral intent, a reminder that even a genuinely successful, adaptable species inevitably reshapes the broader landscape it thrives within, sometimes at direct cost to other species, sharing that same habitat, particularly ones less equipped to withstand sustained predation. Pressure from an animal this capable and this numerous. Raccoon populations and their corresponding impact on vulnerable prey species do not remain static across a landscape. They respond directly to the presence or absence of the larger predators that would otherwise help keep mesopredator numbers in check. In regions where wolves, mountain lions, or other apex predators have been significantly reduced or eliminated entirely, largely through historical hunting and habitat pressure from human expansion, raccoon populations have, in numerous documented cases, expanded considerably, freed from a source of predation and competition that once helped regulate their numbers more tightly. That expansion, in turn, tends to intensify the kind of nest predation pressure just described, since more raccoons foraging across the same landscape inevitably translates into greater cumulative impact on ground nesting birds and other vulnerable prey species already struggling under separate pressures of their own. This entire dynamic illustrates just how deeply interconnected a functioning ecosystem actually is. Removing one predator from the top of a food chain does not simply eliminate a single threat. It can quietly reshape population dynamics several levels further down in ways that are not always immediately obvious to anyone observing only a single piece of that chain in isolation. The raccoon's own remarkable success, in other words, is not happening in isolation either. It is tied directly to decisions and pressures playing out among entirely different species at entirely different points along the very same shared food web. Ecologists have a specific term for the pattern just described: mesopredator release, referring to the population surge and expanded ecological impact. A mid-level predator experiences once the larger predators that once kept it in check are removed from a given landscape. The raccoon stands as one of the clearer, better documented examples of this phenomenon available to researchers studying North American ecosystems. Its historical population expansion, tracking fairly closely alongside the broader decline of larger predators like wolves and mountain lions across much of its range throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Mesopredator release is not unique to raccoons. Similar patterns have been documented in other mid-level predators like coyotes and foxes, as top predators recede from various landscapes. But the raccoon's case offers a particularly clean example given how well its population trends have been tracked over the past century, alongside the parallel decline of the larger carnivores that once helped hold its numbers within tighter bounds. Understanding this concept reframes the raccoon's remarkable success story covered throughout this program in a slightly different light, less a story purely about one animal's individual cleverness and adaptability, and more a story about opportunity created by broader shifts happening across an entire ecosystem. Shifts the raccoons simply proved unusually well equipped to exploit fully once the opportunity presented itself. Cleverness mattered. So evidently did timing. Alongside its ecological role and its considerable behavioral intelligence, the raccoon carries a genuinely serious public health dimension worth addressing directly and without exaggeration. This species stands as one of the primary reservoir species for rabies across much of the eastern United States, meaning raccoons represent a significant ongoing source of the virus within the wild animal population, capable of transmitting it to other wildlife, domestic pets, and in rare cases, humans, primarily through bites from an infected animal. This does not mean every raccoon carries rabies. The overwhelming majority do not. But the species' role as a reservoir means public health and wildlife agencies must actively monitor and manage the disease within raccoon populations, specifically treating it as an ongoing concern rather than a rare isolated event. Signs of rabies infection in a raccoon can include unusual daytime activity, disorientation, or uncharacteristic aggression. Though it bears repeating that daytime activity alone, something already touched on earlier in this program, does not automatically indicate illness in this species, since raccoons will sometimes forage during daylight hours for entirely ordinary reasons, unrelated to disease. Anyone encountering a raccoon behaving in a genuinely erratic or aggressive manner should avoid contact and notify local animal control promptly. This serious risk exists alongside, not instead of everything else this program has covered regarding the species' intelligence and adaptability. A genuine reminder that admiration for a wild animal should never fully replace appropriate caution around it. In direct response to the raccoon's role as a rabies reservoir, species, wildlife, and public health agencies across much of the eastern United States have implemented large-scale oral rabies vaccination programs, specifically targeting wild raccoon populations, an effort involving the distribution of vaccine-laced bait across raccoon habitat, designed to be found and consumed directly by the animals themselves without requiring any kind of capture or handling. These bait packets, often disguised within a fishmeal coating or similar food-scented covering raccoons find naturally appealing, contain a vaccine that once consumed helps build immunity against the virus within the wild population, over time, gradually reducing overall infection rates across a given region. This kind of large-scale wildlife vaccination effort represents a genuinely significant undertaking, requiring careful coordination across multiple states and involving distribution methods ranging from hand placement in targeted areas to aerial drops covering broader stretches of rural and semi-rural habitat. The program stands as a fairly direct acknowledgement of just how significant a public health role this single species plays across a large portion of the country, worth enough sustained investment and coordination to justify an ongoing, multi-state vaccination effort, spanning decades at this point. It is a strange kind of tribute to the raccoon's population success in its own way. An entire coordinated public health infrastructure built specifically around managing disease within one remarkably successful wild species. Beyond rabies, raccoons carry another disease, risk worth understanding clearly and without alarm, a parasitic roundworm called Bacillus ascaris procyon, commonly found in raccoon droppings, particularly around communal latrine sites. This species tends to reuse repeatedly rather than scatter randomly across its territory. Under normal circumstances, this roundworm completes its life cycle within raccoons themselves without posing any issue to the animal. The concern arises because roundworm eggs shed in raccoon droppings can in rare instances be accidentally ingested by humans, most commonly young children, through hand-to-mouth contact after playing in contaminated soil, leading in a small number of documented cases to serious neurological illness once the parasite migrates through the body in a way it was never adapted to navigate safely within a human host. It bears emphasizing that actual human infections remain genuinely rare given how widespread raccoons and their droppings are across the country. But public health officials still recommend straightforward precautions, avoiding direct contact with raccoon latrine sites, supervising young children around areas raccoons frequent, and washing hands thoroughly after any outdoor activity in distinct places of the people are distinct ling, areas known to have raccoon activity. This risk sits alongside everything this program has already covered regarding the animal's genuine intelligence and ecological success. A reminder that admiring this species from a respectful distance remains the wiser approach, rather than encouraging close casual contact of any kind. Disease risk and genuine ecological impact have never stopped the raccoon from holding a beloved, enduring place in American storytelling, a status stretching back long before European settlers ever arrived on this continent. Numerous indigenous nations across North America developed their own raccoon folklore long before written record, frequently casting the animal in the same trickster role that later found its way into more familiar American tales. A clever, resourceful figure who outsmarts larger, seemingly more powerful animals through wit rather than strength. That storytelling tradition continued and evolved as settlers arrived, absorbing their own first-hand observations of raccoon cleverness into an already established trickster archetype, blending older traditions with new direct experience of an animal that kept proving generation after generation just how well that reputation actually fit. Few wild animals have earned quite this consistent a cultural role across such a genuinely long stretch of American storytelling history, hunting indigenous oral tradition through frontier folklore and continuing straight into modern children's literature and popular culture today. That staying power says something meaningful about the raccoon itself. A wild animal whose actual documented behavior, the puzzle solving, the persistent memory, the sheer nightly ingenuity already covered throughout this program, has apparently always matched closely enough with its folklore reputation that neither storytellers nor scientists have ever felt much need to correct the other. That deep cultural connection extended well beyond storytelling and into American fashion at more than one distinct point across the past 2 centuries. The coonskin cap made from raccoon fur, complete with the ringed tail left dangling from the back, became closely associated with frontier folk heroes during the 19th century, and experienced a genuine popular revival during the middle of the 20th century, when television programs celebrating frontier history sparked a nationwide fashion trend among American children eager to imitate their favorite frontier heroes. Decades later, in a considerably different cultural context, full raccoon fur coats became a notable fashion statement among college students during the 1920s. Bulky, warm garments that quickly became associated with a particular collegiate sporting event style of that era, showing up regularly at football games and campus gatherings throughout that decade. Both trends, separated by roughly a century and reflecting entirely different cultural moments, drew directly on the same underlying material. This animal's genuinely warm, dense fur discussed earlier in this program regarding its role in winter insulation. It is a fairly unusual distinction for any wild species to hold, having shaped American fashion trends across two entirely separate historical eras, spanning colonial-era romanticism straight through to 1920s collegiate style, each generation finding its own particular reason to wrap itself, quite literally, in this animal's remarkably effective fur. Return for a moment to the urban boldness research covered earlier in this program and consider just how much of that picture actually remains unresolved. Researchers studying urban raccoon populations have documented real behavioral differences compared to rural populations. Greater boldness, faster approach to novel objects, quicker problem solving in certain contexts. But the precise mechanism driving those differences, and more importantly, the pace at which they might be occurring, remains a genuinely active area of ongoing scientific investigation, rather than a settled conclusion. Some researchers are specifically examining whether measurable physical changes accompany these behavioral shifts. Differences in brain structure or neural organization between urban and rural populations that might parallel the behavioral divergence. Already documented a considerably harder question to answer, given how much more difficult it is to study brain anatomy compared to observable behavior alone. Other lines of ongoing research focus on timescale, attempting to determine whether these urban adaptations represent genuine evolutionary shifts unfolding across raccoon generations, or whether they reflect something closer to a more flexible, individually learned response that simply resets somewhat with each new generation depending on where that particular animal happens to grow up. Neither question has a fully settled answer at this point. What is clear is that raccoons living alongside humans today may not be operating with quite the same brain, in ways still being carefully measured as their rural ancestors did only a few generations back. A second, genuinely open question sits alongside that first one concerning exactly how far raccoon learning actually spreads once it develops. This program has already covered in real depth how thoroughly a mother raccoon teaches her own kits across nearly a full year of direct patient instruction, and how a young raccoon's specific skills often trace directly back to lessons absorbed during that extended period. What remains considerably less clear is whether raccoon knowledge ever spreads meaningfully beyond that immediate family line, whether an unrelated raccoon might observe a neighbor solving a particularly stubborn latch and pick up that same plate of clear by 100 technique through simple observation, the way researchers have documented in certain genuinely social species capable of learning directly from unrelated individuals within a shared group. Raccoons' relatively loose, largely solitary adult social structure covered earlier in this program regarding female kin networks and temporary male coalitions makes this kind of broader knowledge transfer considerably harder to study and document reliably compared to species that live in tighter, more consistently observable social groups. Some researchers suspect a certain amount of cross-family learning likely does occur, particularly in dense urban environments, where unrelated raccoons frequently cross paths while investigating similar food sources. But confirming that suspicion with solid replicable evidence remains a genuinely difficult, still unresolved research challenge. Exactly how far one raccoon's clever discovery actually travels through the wider population remains, for now, a question without a firm answer. A third strand of ongoing research asks whether behavioral and possibly cognitive differences between urban and rural raccoons eventually translate into something deeper, still genuine genetic divergence between the two populations. Researchers studying population genetics have begun examining whether urban raccoon populations show measurable genetic differences compared to nearby rural populations, a question that requires careful patient data collection across multiple generations to answer with real confidence. Since genetic drift and true evolutionary divergence typically require considerably more time to detect reliably than simple behavioral observation does. Early findings in this area remain preliminary. Some studies have detected modest genetic differences between certain urban and rural raccoon populations, though researchers remain appropriately cautious about how much weight those early results can currently bear, given how many additional factors, migration patterns between populations, the sheer geographic scale involved, and the a recent timescale of widespread urban raccoon settlement could plausibly influence those results as well. If genuine genetic divergence is confirmed through further research, it would represent a genuinely significant finding, evidence that human-urban development is actively driving measurable evolutionary change within a wild mammal population, unfolding in real time and within a genuinely observable human timescale, rather than across the usual far longer stretches evolutionary change typically requires. That research remains firmly in progress. One more genuinely open question this remarkable animal has handed to the scientists still working to fully understand it. Every one of the open questions just covered the brain differences still being measured, the uncertain reach of shared learning, the possible genetic divergence still being tested, plays out quietly and continuously in something as ordinary as a locked trash can standing in an actual driveway on an actual ordinary night. Each time a raccoon works a latch, teaches that solution to a litter of kits the following spring. Or perhaps researchers still are not entirely certain, passes some version of that knowledge along to an unrelated neighbor investigating the same block, a small, uncontrolled piece of exactly the research already described plays out, entirely on its own, with no laboratory involved and no researcher present to record it directly. If you have ever stood in your own driveway staring at an overturned trash can, wondering with a certain begrudging respect just how the animal responsible had actually managed it this time, you were witnessing, whether you realized it or not, a live demonstration of everything this program has spent its length trying to explain: memory, curiosity, dexterity, and an adaptability that keeps outpacing whatever solution gets thrown at it next. The neighborhood raccoon working your particular latch tonight is not merely a nuisance to be managed. It is, in its own small and entirely uninvited way, an ongoing contributor to a genuinely open scientific question, one still being worked out, one solved trash can, one rated garden, one new generation of kits at a time. Everything this program has traced: the impossible dens and skyscraper vents and highway sound barriers, the hands built with a density of touch receptors that let this animal read the world through contact alone, the lock studies stretching from wooden mechanisms built more than a century ago, straight through to puzzle boxes tested just this year, the memory spanning years, the curiosity that seems to outlast hunger itself, the sprawling family trees of related females, and the quieter, more temporary alliances among males, the enormous swing from a handful of animals per square mile of prairie to a population rivaling the richest wetland on record, packed into a single, ordinary city block. All of it points toward the same closing thought. This is not simply a clever nuisance raiding your trash can on trash night. It is an animal whose full cognitive and biological picture science has still not entirely finished mapping, with genuinely open questions still being pursued by researchers regarding its brain, its social learning, and the pace at which an entire species may be quietly reshaping itself around human presence in real time, on a timescale short enough for a person alive today to actually witness firsthand. The next time a masked shape crosses your yard after dark, pausing briefly to study a latch or a gate before deciding its next move, consider that you may be watching something considerably more capable and considerably less fully understood than its familiar backyard reputation would ever suggest. Thank you for spending this time here with me. Until next time, good night.